Legacy is a format in Magic where you can use pretty much every card that's ever been printed, except some cards that are banned. So in this series, we'll be going over all the cards in the Legacy ban list and explain why they're banned and if they can come off the ban list. To start off, we're going to go over a group of cards called the Power 9, a set of the 9 strongest cards ever printed in the first set of Magic, and still some of the best cards in the entire game, as well as a few cards that are very similar to the Power 9. Starting us off, we have the Moxen, namely Mox Pearl, Mox Sapphire, Mox Jet, Mox Ruby, and Mox Emerald. This is a cycle of cards that are all 0 mana and each tap for one of the 5 colors of Magic. These cards, like the rest of the Power 9, were restricted in the very first banned and restricted announcement all the way back in 1994, where they were restricted in the entire game as there weren't different formats in Magic at the time. The Power 9 stayed on the Vintage restricted list for the rest of the game's history, and were grandfathered onto the Legacy ban list when the format was created. Why were the Moxen banned? The simple answer is that they're a mana positive card with absolutely no downside at all that permanently ramps you, which is obviously too strong. Getting a little more in depth with it, if you think about it, Moxen are basically just lands. They tap for a mana every turn and cost no mana to play. However, unlike lands, there isn't any restriction to how many Moxen you can play on a single turn. This means that they're basically strictly better lands. The only downside, if you can call it one, is that they're more vulnerable to removal, as destroying artifacts is easier than destroying lands, but this isn't really that relevant. Now, this would pretty obviously be a problem on its own, as no deck would turn down playing a card this powerful, making them extremely generic staples that literally every deck would play. However, this is only the first issue. The bigger issue is how they affect the way the game plays. Having this much mana on turn 1 can basically allow you to set up incredibly powerful plays. Legacy already has tons of decks that can kill you on turn 1, but these cards would increase the number of these decks substantially, making their turn 1 kills even more consistent and making them far harder to interact with. To put this into perspective, cards like Mox Diamond and Chrome Mox, Moxen that require to discard a land or exile a non-land, non-artifact card from your hand in order to use them respectively, still see a ton of play in the format despite their downsides. However, the issues don't stop there. Even if you're playing a fair matchup, the extra mana can make it basically impossible to win the game. If one player starts with 3 lands in their hand and the other starts with 3 Moxen in their hand, the player with the Moxens will often just win the game by default. Having 3 mana on your first turn and being able to carry that into the future is far, far stronger than having to play 1 land a turn and slowly wait to get your mana up. This means that the Moxen player will be making more plays and making stronger plays. It'll be nearly impossible for the player who only drew lands to come back. This is why the Moxen need to be banned. They're useful in literally every deck, and in a format as fast and as strong as Legacy, they create a lot of non-games. Even though they do technically benefit every deck equally, they make the format as a whole a lot worse if they came back. Could the Moxen be unbanned? No, they're still too good. If you want a swingy, more powerful version of Magic with all the Magic's most busted cards, Vintage exists, and the Moxen are still restricted to 1 copy there. Unbanning them in Legacy would be unnecessary because there's a format for cards like the Moxen already, not to mention that having 4 copies of Mox in your deck leads to far more busted starts in non-games than being restricted to 1 copy does. How could the Moxen be fixed to be unbanned? As I mentioned earlier, we already have fixed Moxen. Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond are still very strong cards, but the cost of losing 1 card from your hand is real enough to make them fair play in Legacy. Up next, we have Black Lotus, one of the most iconic cards in all of Magic. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 0, and the ability where you can tap it and sacrifice it to add 3 mana of any one color. Why was Black Lotus banned? The simple answer is that it makes way too many strong and powerful combos, and improves the combos already legal way too much. As I mentioned with Moxen, hitting specific mana thresholds is really important for combo decks. That can let them play their important cards like Ad Nauseam way earlier, as early as turn 1 with the right hands. To illustrate how busted this card is, let's take a look at Lotus Petal and Lion's Eye Diamond, cards that were attempts at fixing the Lotus's busted effect. Petal is the exact same as Lotus, but it only adds a paltry 1 mana. And Lion's Eye Diamond is the exact same as Lotus, except it can only be activated at instant speed, meaning it can't be activated while paying for a spell, and it has the additional cost where you have to discard your entire hand. Despite how much worse both of these cards are than Lotus, combo decks have been relying on them for years to help power out their combos earlier. People have found tons of combos to try and make LED basically be a Lotus, and they found tons of ways to make the card incredibly strong. People will do things like cast a draw spell and crack their diamond in response, and just hope they draw the cards they need to combo off, because getting 3 free mana for 1 card is simply that powerful. Could Black Lotus be unbanned? No, the card is simply too powerful in the right decks. Unbanning Lotus wouldn't be quite as bad as unbanning the Moxen, mostly because the damage would be restricted to 1 archetype of deck, but it would make combo decks far too strong. How could Black Moxen be fixed to be unbanned? Like with Moxen, we essentially already have fixed version in Lotus Petal and Lion's Eye Diamond, and there aren't that many other ways you can fix the card. Next up, we have Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. Soul Ring is an artifact with a mana cost of 1 and the ability where you can tap to add 2 colorless mana. Mana Crypt is an artifact with a mana cost of 0 and the ability where you can tap it to add 2 colorless, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you flip a coin, and if you lose the coin flip, Mana Crypt deals 3 damage to you. Mana Crypt was banned in September of 1999, and Soul Ring was restricted on the first list in 1994 with the power 9, and that ban has also carried on into Legacy. Now, why were these cards banned? These cards were banned for a very similar reason to the Moxen, though the fact they produce colorless mana makes them a bit harder to use in a lot of circumstances. Producing this much mana for so little investment lets you power out tons of combos way faster, and lets you pull further ahead each turn in a fair matchup. In fact, since they make 2 mana instead of 1, in a lot of decks, these are actually better than the Moxen. For example, one deck that could use these cards would be a deck that plays soul lands like City of Traders and Ancient Tomb. Lands that tap for 2 mana, and then use these cards to slam powerful stacks pieces like Chalice of the Void and Lodgestone Golem into play on turn 1. Combining this with the artifact synergies like Mystic Forge, and you have a deck that's extremely powerful. In fact, this is the basis of a deck called Shops in Vintage, though the eponymous Mistra's Workshop is banned in Legacy, so it won't be able to be played exactly the same way here. Basically, these cards are just extra Moxen that are better in some circumstances and worse in others, though on average, they're often better. For example, in the fan format Canadian Highlander, there's a point system where cards have a specific point value assigned to them, and you can only have 10 points of a card in your deck. In that format, Moxen are pointed at 3, and Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are pointed at 4. Now, there are some additional differences, as Canadian Highlander is a singleton format, but still, it's worth noting that there are contexts where these cards are considered more powerful than even the Moxen. Could these cards be unbanned? No, they're still way too strong. They do everything the Moxen can do, and often more. How could these cards be fixed to be unbanned? Really, this kind of fast mana is just too powerful. There's not really a fix besides bone of the mana cost of a more reasonable amount of mana. Next up, we have Ancestral Recall. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 blue, and it has the effect where target player draws 3 cards. This card was also restricted in the very first ban list. Why was Ancestral Recall banned? Drawing 3 cards is a very strong effect, and this is simply far too little mana for it. Generally, this cost is around 4 mana. And there are some versions of this effect at 3 mana, but 1 mana is absolutely unheard of. This much card advantage is really hard to beat, especially with cards like Force of Will being staples in the format. Force's downside of having to go -1 to counter a spell for free has never stopped it from being a format-defining staple in Legacy. And being able to recoup all that card advantage and get even more in the process is extremely strong. Now, the reason being so low mana costing is such a big deal, despite there being other draw spells in the format that can draw a similar number of cards, is that it means you don't really have to slow down to play the card. Normally, you'd have to give up tempo to play a draw spell, giving your opponent a chance to act without you having mana. However, because Recall is so cheap, you can just cast it without ever losing a hole in your defense. Or spam it to just find the right card you need whenever you want and basically lose nothing. With this card legal, there's basically no reason to play any other color besides blue. Blue decks could easily counter anything relevant your opponent did and draw so many cards that they'd never be able to come back. Legacy already has a very blue-heavy metagame, but this would make playing a non-blue deck a complete non-option. Could Ancestral Recall be unbanned? No. Blue is already too strong, and this would lead to it being the best color by a mile, as well as make it so that there were tons of non-games where one player drew a few recalls and forces and proceeded to completely snowball into winning, with basically no way for their opponent to do anything. How could Recall be fixed to be unbanned? Pretty much every way there is to fix this card has already been tried. 1 blue draw spells like Ponder, Preordain, and Consider basically fulfill the same role as Recall, just at a level that's far closer to being fair. So a fixed version of Recall basically already exists. Next up, we have Time Walk. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue, and it has the effect where you take an extra turn after this one. Like the rest of the Power 9, this card is restricted in the first ban and restricted announcement in 1994. Why was Time Walk banned? This card is similar to Recall, where it simply has far too strong of an effect for far too small of a mana cost. The cheapest take an extra turn cards are priced at 5 mana, such as Time Warp, which is over twice the cost of Walk. Time Warp has seen a fair amount of play in decks over the years, though not in formats like Legacy. Now, taking an extra turn is a very strong effect, but it's usually not quite as good as it looks. The thing is, all playing a take an extra turn spell does on its own is let you play another land, untap all your lands, and draw a card to replace itself. This isn't quite strong enough to actually be good. However, they're extremely powerful with another card in play. If you have a creature on field that can let you attack and then untap to attack again, or if you can play another creature on that turn, it allows it to attack next turn, sort of giving the card haste, as it won't be summoning sick on your next turn. If you have any Planeswalkers, it lets you use their loyalty abilities all over again. I'm bringing all this up because the lower the mana cost of an extra turn spell, the more likely you can make use of these effects. A lot of the time, you'll only have 3 or so damage on board, so paying 5 mana to attack again won't be quite worth it. However, paying 2 mana is a lot more manageable, and will be far more useful, far more often. Finally, the thing that really makes this card insane, outside of how powerful it can be in the right circumstances, and the fact that it's very easy to make the card strong compared to other similar cards, is how low the floor is. The floor of this card is how good it is in the worst circumstances. And in the worst circumstances, when you cast Walk, you get all your mana back and can play an extra land and get to draw a card to replace it. It's basically a better Explore in that circumstance. This is what makes it, in effect, so broken. A lot of the time, it's just good. It's a free cycle that allows you to develop your mana base more. However, sometimes it's just straight up winning you the game. Both the floor and ceiling, or how good the card is in the best circumstances, are just way, way too high. Could Time Walk be unbanned? Absolutely not. This card does everything bad that all the cards I've mentioned before do. It makes blue way too strong, and it leads to too many non-games. The card is still way, way too good. How could Time Walk fix to be unbanned? Besides increasing the mana cost, there are ways to fix the card. There's a card called Speed Time, which is a take on extra turn spell for 1 and 1 green, the same mana value as Walk, but it has the restriction where you only get to take an extra turn if your opponent casts a blue spell this turn. By adding a similar heavy restriction to Walk, you could make it bad enough that would be okay to unban. And finally, we have Time Twister and Wheel of Fortune. Time Twister is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue, and the effect where both players shuffle their hand and graveyard into the library and then draw 7 cards. Wheel of Fortune has the effect where each player discards their hand and then draws 7 cards. Time Twister was hit on the very first ban restricted announcement, but Wheel survived a bit longer, getting banned just a few months later in March of 1994. Why were these cards banned? Similar to Recall, these cards draw you too many cards for way too little mana. While they do give your opponents cards too, the fact that you got to use this card first made them extremely powerful. 3 mana to draw a new hand of 7 cards is very strong, especially when your deck is full of fast mana cards like Lotus Petal and Chrome Mox, or back in the day, the other members of the power like Black Lotus and the original Moxen. This would let you do things like play out your hand, cast one of these wheels to refill your hand, then play even more fast mana cards. Then you might have the mana for another wheel or draw effect to continue comboing off. Currently, there are decks that function the similar way in Legacy, using Lion's Eye Diamond and a new version of Time Twister, Echo of Eons, which has the same effect but costs 4 and 2 blue, but has a flashback cost of 2 and 1 blue, which means you can cast it from your graveyard, but you have to exile it afterwards. With these 2 cards, you can cast LED and then crack it for mana, discarding your Echo. Now that it's in your graveyard, you can cast it for its flashback costs, meaning that it's basically just Black Lotus and Twister, just with some additional restrictions. This deck then uses cards like the previously mentioned fast mana and extra draw spells to cast a bunch of cards, before finally ending off with Tendrils of Agony. This is a spell with Storm, meaning when you cast it, you get an extra copy for each other spell you've cast this turn, and it has the effect where target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Since you'll be casting a bunch of ramp spells and draw spells before it, you'll easily be able to cast at least 9 other spells before Tendrils, making it drain your opponent for lethal. Both Twister and Wheel can do the same thing, but even better under some circumstances. However, there are a few other applications. There are cards like Narset, Partner of Veils, and Hull Breacher, which make it so that your opponent can't draw more than 1 card, or draw a card outside of their draw step. By combining these cards with Wheel, you get to make your opponent discard their entire hand while refilling your own, which basically wins you the game right there. Right now, decks are using Days Undoing, a version of Time Twister that ends your turn when you use it, getting rid of the upside where you get to use the cards first to pull this combo off. All in all, there are just too many ways to abuse these cards. Could Time Twister and Wheel of Fortune be unbanned? This is another no, but it's far closer than any card we've talked about today. The thing is, these cards wouldn't necessarily be that crazy in combo decks given the current format. Remember, decks already have access to Echo of Eons, and with LED, the card usually works better in those decks than these wheels do, since cards like Black Lotus aren't currently legal. Really, the scary decks of these cards would be the fair decks in the format and the decks you can combine it with draw lock cards. This is far closer to being able to be unbanned, but they're still too good at the end of the day. How could these cards be fixed to be unbanned? Like all the cards we've talked about, there are a few fixed versions of these cards. Echo of Eons and Days Undoing are good attempts at fixing the cards. There's also the versions that cost extra mana, like Time Reversal, and these cards are perfectly fine as well. We have Demonic Tutor, the namesake of the phrase tutoring. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of 1 and 1 black and the effect where you search your library for a card to put into your hand and then shuffle. This card was restricted in March of 1994 before Legacy existed, and was grandfathered onto Legacy ban lists when the format was created. Why is Demonic Tutor banned? It's hard to put it into words because the effect is just obviously very strong and the cost for it is way too low. When playing a card game, there are lots of times where you think, man, I wish I had drawn this one card. And tutors are basically just every card in your deck with an added mana cost. This makes tutors the best consistency boosters in the entire game. Now, while this effect is very strong, everything in Magic is about mana cost. If you make something cost enough, you can basically make any effect fair. It's worth noting that 2 mana is the cheapest amount for a tutor, outside of tutors with some additional downsides. So, why is a very cheap tutor too good? The issue is that there are tons of cards that can kinda just win you the game in the right circumstances, and being able to find them for just 2 mana is kind of crazy. For example, lots of decks have cards that they just kind of lose to. Tutor can find really powerful hate cards like Rest in Peace or Chalice of the Void to completely shut down what your opponent is doing. However, the situations where the card is best in is in combo decks. There are lots of combos in Magic where if you can manage to cast both cards in the combo, they can win you the game on the spot. A simple example is something like Splinter Twin and Pestermite. By comboing Twin's ability to let you tap a creature to make a creature with Pestermite's ability to untap a creature whenever it enters the battlefield, you can make an infinite number of creatures and win the game on the spot. Now, this specific combo doesn't see play in Legacy, it's just an example that can be used to illustrate a point. The thing is, a tutor is basically 4 extra copies of both of your combo pieces in your deck. If you have one half of your combo, you can use a tutor to find the other half. Now, the combos in Legacy are usually a bit more complex, and you can substitute some cards for other cards depending on the circumstances, but tutors are still really great at increasing your consistency, especially since they can find you whatever happens to be best in any particular circumstance. All in all, this level of efficiency is just too high for Legacy, so the card has been banned for the format's entire existence. Could Demonic Tutor be unbanned? This is far closer than it has any right to be, but it's still a no. The fact is, paying 2 mana to find any card you want is pretty close to a fair price in Legacy right now, because the format is so fast and has such powerful interaction. Demonic Tutor is the best at what it does, but there are replacements that people have used that are very close. For example, Infernal Tutor can either add another copy of a card in your hand to your hand, or can search your library for any card if your hand is empty. By using Lion's Eye Diamond, decks are able to turn this into Demonic Tutor whenever they want. So combo decks already have access to this effect, but they have to jump through some hoops for it. Demonic Tutor would be stronger, but it's not like the format's never seen anything like this. The boost and power it provides would be just a little bit too much to too many decks, but it's not quite as crazy as it sounds. How could Demonic Tutor be fixed to be unbanned? There are already a ton of fixed versions of Demonic Tutor, such as the previously mentioned Infernal Tutor. Another way the card could be fixed is by having to put the card on top of your deck instead of directly into your hand, as this would make the card a lot slower and make it a card disadvantage, which would make it slow and costly enough to not be broken. Next up, we have 2 very similar cards, Vampiric Tutor and Imperial Seal. Vampiric Tutor is an instant with a mana cost of 1 black and the effect where you search your library for a card, shuffle, and then put that card on top of your library. Then you lose 2 life. Imperial Seal is a source with a mana cost of 1 black with the exact same effect. Vampiric Tutor was banned in September of 1999, and Imperial Seal was banned in September of 2005. Why were these cards banned? They're banned for very similar reasons to Demonic Tutor, as the raw efficiency of finding any card you want for so little mana is incredibly powerful. Now, these cards do make you lose card advantage, which is a real downside, but to make up for that, they only cost 1 mana. Even better, Vampiric Tutor is an instant, so you can just wait until the end of your opponent's turn to go and find the perfect card to try and win on your own turn. This instant speed makes Vampiric Tutor the only tutor that rivals Demonic Tutor for its title of Best Tutor. On top of all this, there are also some niche applications to hiding the card you're tutoring for on the top of your library. For example, your opponent can't use Thoughtseize to rip the card from your hand, and since most of these effects are sorcery speed, you should be more than safe from hand disruption. All in all, these tutors were just too powerful for the format. Could Imperial Seal and Vampiric Tutor be unbanned? Starting with Vampiric Tutor, the answer is still no. As I said earlier, the power level of this card is very close to Demonic Tutor, and the cards are in a very similar spot. They're pretty close to being fine, but they're still just a little bit too good for where the format is right now. On the other hand, Imperial Seal could probably come back and be fine, though it would be very strong. It's really important to consider just how much being a sorcery hurts this card. There are tons of use cases that Vampiric Tutor has that you simply don't have with Imperial Seal. Even just having to cast it during your main phase instead of at the end of your opponent's turn is a huge downside. Due to all these downsides, Imperial Seal is more likely to be unbanned without really breaking anything, as it would just make certain decks stronger but wouldn't break them. How could these cards be fixed to be unbanned? Funnily enough, Imperial Seal is currently kind of a fixed version of Vampiric Tutor. Another way to fix these cards, besides making it sorcery speed, would just to do something like having it hide the card you find second from the top of your library, or exiling the card face down and put it into your hand at the beginning of your next end step, as well as making you skip your next draw step. These nerfs would hurt the card enough that it could come off the ban list pretty easily. Next up, we have Mystical Tutor. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 blue. It has the effect where you can search your library for an instant or sorcery card, reveal it, and then shuffle the card and put it on top of your library. This card was banned in June of 2010. Why was Mystical Tutor banned? The simple answer is that it wasn't really that far off from just being a vampiric tutor in a lot of decks. Most combo decks were searching for instants and sorcery cards anyway, so you didn't actually lose very much by playing Mystical Tutor. Most combo decks are using something like Show and Tell and Ad Nauseam to end the game, and beyond those finishers, most of their best cards were instants or sorceries. Beyond finding combo pieces, it could also help find ramp spells like Dark Ritual, draw spells like Brainstorm, and powerful counter spells like Force of Will. To put it simply, Mystical Tutor was able to find too many important cards for too many decks, so it was banned. Could Mystical Tutor be unbanned? This is barely a no, but it's very close to being able to be unbanned. The restrictions on the card barely aren't enough to make the card fine. The thing is, the card is mostly just a vampiric tutor. The main downside of the card is actually having to reveal what you searched to your opponent, but this usually won't matter, as if you're using it on your own combo turn to win the game, the knowledge they gain won't matter most of the time. Now, it's worth noting that Mystical Tutor probably wouldn't break the game if it were unbanned right now, as combo decks are a bit weak in the metagame right now due to how strong decks like Zed Delver are, which are built to be able to stop combo decks in their tracks. However, the main issue is the card becoming an issue in the future. If the metagame balances out some more, the boost in consistency to combo decks could become a huge issue for the metagame at large. However, this is largely speculative and depends on how the metagame changes in the future, so someone who's fine with needing to reban the cards in the future might want to unban the card. How could Mystical Tutor be fixed to be unbanned? Almost any nerf to the card would be more than enough. Making it a sorcery would make it a slightly better personal tutor, and the card's not broken in Legacy. This would be more than enough to let the card be unbanned. Next up, we have Survival of the Fittest. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has the ability where you can pay 1 green and discard a creature card to search your library for a creature card, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle. Survival of the Fittest was banned in December of 2010. Why was Survival of the Fittest banned? This card was simply too good at allowing decks to find the right creatures whenever they wanted them. You could find cards like Fairy Macabre to exile cards from your opponent's graveyard, Quasali Pridemage to remove key artifacts or enchantments, or powerful lock pieces like Gadok Teague to stop certain decks in their tracks. Being able to be used multiple times made the card a lot stronger as well. You see, there were a ton of cards that synergized with Survival to make the card even stronger. Decks like Big Game Hunter had the Madness mechanic, which allowed you to cast them for their Madness cost whenever you discarded them. This made using Survival to discard them a 2-for-1, giving you a ton of card advantage. However, the best card to discard with Survival might be Squee, Goblin Nabob. This is a 1/1 goblin with the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, if Squee is in your graveyard, you may return him to your hand. This lets you discard Squee once a turn to go find any creature you wanted, getting you a ton of value. This level of flexibility and card advantage was simply too much for Legacy, so the card was banned. Could Survival of the Fittest be unbanned? Yes, definitely. The format has gotten a lot faster since 2010, and paying 3 mana to tutor out a creature just isn't good enough anymore. The card might spawn some new decks, or it might see a little bit of play in the more mid-range varieties of elf decks, but it wouldn't break anything. Bringing the card back would be more than fine nowadays. How could Survival of the Fittest be fixed to be unbanned? The card is fine as is, so it doesn't need to be changed at all. Next up, we have Tinker. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has the additional cost where you have to sacrifice an artifact, and the effect where you can search your library for an artifact, put it into the battlefield, and then shuffle. This card was banned in September of 1999. Why is Tinker banned? The simple answer is that there are tons of cheap artifacts to sacrifice and tons of great artifacts to tutor for. Early Magic especially has a lot of great artifacts like the Moxen, which paired great with Tinker. On top of that, there are also tons of artifacts that end the game when you play them. For example, Brightsteel Colossus is a giant 11/11 with Trample, Indestructible, and Infect. This is a massive threat that can end the game with just one swing. There are other great artifacts to find, like Bolas's Citadel, which allows you to look at the top card of your library at any time and allows you to cast the top card of your library by paying life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. The amount of card advantage this can give you is crazy, and being able to cheat it out for just 3 mana is a steal. Better than just cheating out crazy threats, Tinker can also find you the best card for any situation. It doesn't just cheat out an artifact, it cheats out any artifact in your deck, allowing you to find the best creatures in the game fast based on the board state, or find a powerful lock piece if you need to try and survive for longer. For example, something like Ensnaring Bridge or Trinisphere. The combination of this level of power and versatility led to the card being banned at Legacy to rein in its power level. Could Tinker be unbanned? No, but it's kind of closer than it has any right to be. You see, most of the best artifacts to play with Tinker are already banned in Legacy. All the Moxen, Black Lotus, and things like Time Vault are already banned. This means that there's actually kind of a deck building cost to playing Tinker, unlike there is in Vintage. The end result is that only decks that would already want to play artifacts would really play Tinker. For example, 8-cast. Now, this would end up being too good for the format, as there are still decks built around artifacts that would love the power and flexibility that Tinker provides. Ultimately, the card is still too good at what it does, but it's not quite the menace a lot of players remember it being anymore. How could Tinker be fixed beyond ban? This is another card that Wizards has already released fixed versions of. Cards like Reshape do a good job fixing Tinker. Another solution is making the card work more like Eldritch Evolution, where it lets you find an artifact with a mana cost of 2 plus the mana value of the card you sacrifice. Letting it find literally any artifact is the only issue with this card, as requiring you to sacrifice an artifact limits it enough outside of being able to cheat out giant expensive artifacts. Finally, the last card is Goblin Recruiter. This is a 1/1 goblin with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for any number of goblin cards, reveal them, shuffle, then stack them on top of your library in any order. This card was banned in September of 2004. Why is Goblin Recruiter banned? Recruiter allows goblin decks to stack their deck for easy turn 2 kills. There were a few ways to accomplish this. One version of the combo was with Food Chain. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 and 1 green that has the ability where you can exile a creature you control to add X mana of any one color, where X is the card's mana value, but you can only use this mana to cast creature spells. To see how this combo works, we need to go over a few other cards as well. Goblin Ringleader is a goblin that costs 3 and 1 red, with the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you can reveal the top 4 cards of your library, and put all goblin cards you find into your hand, then put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. Goblin Warchief is a goblin that costs 1 and 2 red, and has the abilities where your goblin cards cost 1 less to cast, and all your goblins have haste. How the deck work is that you would use Crow Mox to get an extra mana on turn 1. Then you would play Goblin Recruiter and put 4 Ringleaders on top of your deck, followed by a Warchief, and then put 12 other goblins on the top of the deck. On turn 2, you would play another land, giving you 2 mana for Food Chain, as well as draw your first copy of Ringleader. Use Food Chain to make 3 red mana by exiling your Recruiter, and then you play another Goblin card and exile it to Food Chain again. This would give you 4 red mana to cast your Ringleader. You play Ringleader and draw 3 more Ringleaders in the Warchief. Next, you just play Ringleader after Ringleader to draw the last 12 goblins, ending with 3 red floating mana. You cast 1 goblin, make an extra red, and then play Warchief. Then you slowly spam out the rest of your hand, ending on a board of several pile drivers with haste as well as a few other goblins that would let you attack for way more than 20 damage on turn 2. However, it also required a pretty specific hand to pull off. The main reason this was so good is because outside of your food chains, you were just a normal goblin deck. Goblins were already a perfectly fine deck in Legacy, and they still see some play to this day. Being a fine goblin deck on top of being able to just kill your opponent out of nowhere was way too much for Legacy all the way back in 2004. Could Goblin Recruiter be unbanned? The answer is no. These food chain lines are a bit too slow and inconsistent for modern day Legacy. Now, however, the card is still very good, and cards like Conspicuous Snoop being printed have made it far better, as the combo lines are way stronger than they used to be. However, another big issue with the card is time issues. Resolving a Recruiter can take a long time, especially since your piles can often decide whether you win or not. Players will often have to spend a lot of time thinking about how they stack their piles, and this can really slow down tournaments. Cards like Doomsday are already slow enough, and it limits you to just grabbing 5 cards. The combination of possibly being too strong and being very slow means that Recruiter needs to stay banned. How could Goblin Recruiter be fixed to be unbanned? Limiting to only letting you stack your deck with 1 Goblin card would be enough. Bogard Harbinger sees play in modern day Goblin decks, sometimes specifically because of being able to stack your deck with certain Goblins is really good with Conspicuous Snoop and Goblin Ringleader. Giving them a cheaper and better version of it would be overall good for the format, as Goblins would be fine with a power boost. We have Necropotence. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 black. It has the abilities where you skip your draw step. Whenever you discard a card, you exile that card, and you can pay 1 life to exile the top card of your deck face down, and then put that card into your hand at the beginning of your next end step. This card was banned in September of 2000. Why was Necropotence banned? Being able to pay 1 life to draw a card, even at the end of your turn, is still extremely powerful. Getting to draw this many cards for just 3 mana is kind of insane. For 3 mana, you usually only get to draw 2 or maybe 3 cards. Getting to draw as many cards as you want, as long as you're willing to pay a bit of life, is way too good for just 3 mana. The card's downsides simply aren't enough to balance this out. Having to skip your next draw step isn't really a downside when you're already drawing so many cards, and exiling the cards you discard is basically a slap on the wrist. This card was great in just about every black deck, as getting to refill so many cards makes it basically impossible for your opponent to win. Now, there are some downsides to this. This will leave you at a dangerously low life total, but this usually won't actually matter. As long as you win before your opponent can actually kill you, you'll just be fine. Fair decks were usually able to do this by being careful about when and how they played Necropotence. Back in the day, players would play Ivory Tower, an artifact that costs 1 that lets you gain life equal to the number of cards in your hand minus 4 at the end of your turn, to gain them a ton of life to keep drawing more cards off Necropotence and keep them healthy, stopping their opponent from killing them. While this is good in fair decks, the crazy part was playing this with combo decks. Lots of decks throughout the years, and especially in formats like Legacy, Have 2 or 3 card combos that can just win you the game right there. Usually what happens is the player plays Necropotence and then pays half their life, at least, to draw into a combo. On the next turn, they slam that combo into play and win the game. And with being able to draw so many cards, you should be able to find your combo pretty easily. You just have to make sure your opponent doesn't kill you right then. Even worse, there are cards like Dark Ritual, a 1-mana instant that adds 3 black. With this, you can play Necropotence on turn 1. At that point, your opponent would basically never be able to kill you before your next turn, so you'd be able to win the game no problem. All this power and consistency proved to be far too much, so Wizards banned the card to weaken combo decks in Legacy. Could Necropotence be unbanned? No. The card is still too good at drawing you cards. The weakness of drawing you the cards at the end of the turn are more relevant than they used to be, but the power of the card is just too high for Legacy. How could Necropotence be fixed to be unbanned? Increasing the mana cost to something like 5 mana would do it, as then it wouldn't be better than cards like Ad Nauseam that are seen play in the format. Besides increasing the mana cost, being limited to only being able to activate the ability a certain number of times, like 3 times, would be enough too. Bring it in line with cards like Cruel Bargain. The card does need to be able to draw you around 10 or so cards to be worth it, as you do need to draw into your combo, or cards that can help you find your combo. Skipping your draw step is a big enough downside that players won't do it if they can't draw enough cards quickly enough. Otherwise, they'd use the better options already available in the format. Next up, we have a very similar card, Yawgmoth's Bargain. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 4 and 2 black. It has the abilities where you skip your draw step and you can pay 1 life to draw a card. This card was banned in September of 1999. Why was Yawgmoth's Bargain banned? Well, the card is basically just Necropotence's older brother. For more mana, you get a version of the card where you get to draw the cards right away and you don't have to exile any cards you discard. There are 2 pretty big upsides that make the card a lot stronger than Necropotence once it's actually on the battlefield. Since you don't have to wait to draw your cards, you don't have to wait to combo either. Legacy is full of cards that allow you to make extra mana, such as Lotus Petal and Dark Ritual. With these cards, even if you're tapped out, you can start drawing through your deck until you draw a card like Petal to get your mana, and finish your combo from there. This means that while it is more expensive, it's far more likely to win the game once it actually hits play. Could Yawgmoth's Bargain be unbanned? Yes, absolutely. The thing is, there's already basically better versions of it legal. We've already mentioned Ad Nauseam, but let's look a bit closer at what the card does. For 5 mana, this card lets you repeat the following any number of times. You reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand, then lose life equal to its mana value. The thing is, most spells in combo decks and Legacy cost 1 or 2 mana. Add in all the lands that are in your deck and the 0 mana spells like Petal and Lion's Eye Diamond, and the average mana value of a combo deck in Legacy hovers around exactly 1. This means that, for less mana, Ad Nauseam is drawing you the same number of cards as Bargain. However, there's more. The difference between a 5 and 6 mana is a pretty important mana threshold as well. You see, if you have 1 land and 2 Dark Rituals, you can make exactly 5 mana. This lets you cast Ad Nauseam and win, but doesn't let you cast Bargain. This difference in mana threshold will matter enough that most decks would choose to run Ad Nauseam over Bargain. The only decks that would really want Bargain would be fair decks like Nick Fit, that might want to use a card like Academy Reactor to cheat it into play. While this would be strong, these decks can't just combo off and kill you after playing the Bargain. And even though they likely will win afterward, playing and killing a 4-mana creature is a big enough task that most decks in the format could deal with it fine. All in all, there's just not a place where Bargain would actually break Legacy anymore. So, how could Yawgmoth's Bargain be fixed to be unbanned? The card is already okay to be unbanned, so it doesn't really need any changes. Next up, we have Yawgmoth's Will and Underworld Breach. Will is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It has the effect where, for the rest of this turn, you can play lands and cast spells from your graveyard, and if a card would be put into your graveyard the rest of this turn, you exile it instead. Yawgmoth's Will was banned in September of 1999. Underworld Breach is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has the abilities where each non-land card in your graveyard has escape, and their escape cost is equal to their mana cost, plus exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. This means that you can cast them from your graveyard. And it has the ability where, at the beginning of your end step, you sacrifice Underworld Breach. This card was banned in March of 2020. Why were these cards banned? Starting with Yawgmoth's Will, the ability to recast all the cards in your graveyard is extremely strong. Not only does this natively give you a ton of card advantage, but there are tons of ways to use Yawgmoth's Will to make it even stronger. The most common use case for Will was to use a ton of cards like Petal and Dark Ritual to add a ton of mana, cast a draw spell like Night's Whisper, and then use Will to do it all again, getting even more mana and cards out of nowhere. The ability to cast all of your spells twice made Will one of the strongest draw spells in the game. Basically, it just drew you a second copy of every card already in your graveyard, which was often enough to win you the game in a lot of combo decks. For an example, let's say your opponent's opening hand was a Swamp, 4 Dark Rituals, a Tendrils of Agony, and Yawgmoth's Will. So, you would cast all 4 of your Dark Rituals, making 9 black mana. You would cast Tendrils, which would copy itself 4 times due to Storm, dealing 10 damage to your opponent. Then you would will recast all of your Dark Rituals again, and then Tendrils them again, now getting 10 copies of them, doing a ton of damage on your opponent and winning the game on turn 1. Now, this is a pretty specific opening hand, but the thing is, there are tons of ways to get to a very similar situation on turn 1 or 2. The result is that Will is simply way too good at letting you put your combo together, and the card was banned as a result. As crazy as Will is, Underworld Breach is somehow even better. It costs less mana, making it a lot easier to cast, and does a very good Yawgmoth's Will impression, but there are tons of ways to actually make the card better than Will. You see, there's a card called Brain Freeze, an instant that costs 1 and 1 blue with the effect where target player mills 3, and it also has Storm. By combining this with Lion's Eye Diamond, an artifact that costs 0 and lets you sacrifice it and discard your hand to make 3 mana, but only at a time you can cast an instant. So, how this would work is that you would get enough mana to cast Underworld Breach and Brain Freeze on the same turn. You would cast it and then target yourself to make yourself mill 6 cards. Then you would use LED to make 3 blue mana, discarding your hand in the process. Next, you would use mana to Brain Freeze yourself again, milling even more cards due to increase in your storm count. Then you would recast LED and make more mana, and keep going back and forth between Brain Freeze and LED until your storm count is high enough that you can just mill your opponent out. This infinite was how Underworld Breach was used in its short tenure in the format. Not only can this just be a Yawg's Will, it can be used in combos that Will can't, making it far too strong for the format. Can Yawgmoth's Will or Underworld Breach be unbanned? This is a no for both of them. Yawg's Will is still good at letting you put together their combos, letting them draw way too many cards and make way too much mana. Underworld Breach does the same thing to a lesser degree, but the Brain Freeze combo is incredibly strong as well, and combining that with how much value Breach can make you makes the card way too good. How could Yawgmoth's Will or Underworld Breach be fixed to be unbanned? These cards really just need to cost significantly more mana, and there's not much more you can do to fix these cards outside of what would basically be completely changing their effects. Making them cost closer to 5 mana would let them be strong, but would put them more in line with other powerful draw spells in the format. Next up, we have Oath of Druids. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has the ability where, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if one of the player's opponents controls more creatures than them, they can reveal cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. Then they put the creature card into the battlefield and put the rest into their graveyard. This card was banned in December 2003 and extended, and remained banned in Legacy ever since. Why was Oath of Druids banned? It turns out there are ways to abuse this card to let you spin into giant threats very consistently. Thanks to cards like Forbidden Orchard, you can easily give your opponents creatures, making it so Oath will let you spin into your giant threats. And those threats are extremely powerful. Cards like Niv Mizzet, Parun, and Grizzlebrand can draw you a ton of cards, giving you access to tons of interaction and making sure you can spin into another threat next turn. There are also threats that can let you end the game extremely quickly, such as Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, a massive 15/15 with Annihilator 6, an ability that forces your opponent to sacrifice 6 permanents whenever Emrakul attacks. A 2-mana combo card that doesn't require you to cast anything else is way more efficient than the rest of the combos in Legacy right now. Most of these combos require getting a lot more mana, such as the Storm decks in Legacy. And while there are tons of ways to get this mana, not needing to play these ramp cards allows you to play more draw spells like Brainstorm and more interaction like Force of Will, allowing you to stop your opponent from comboing or to try and protect your combo from your opponent's interaction. This makes the deck far more resilient and powerful, and puts it heads and shoulders over other similar combo decks like Show and Tell decks. Additionally, not having to draw your big creatures makes the deck way more consistent. In Vintage, where Oath of Druids is legal, the deck only plays 2 or 3 threats to spin into, whereas Show and Tell usually plays several playsets of their payoffs. This makes Oath decks way more consistent and less reliant on Brainstorm to put their bricks back into the library. All in all, this made Oath of Druids way too strong of a combo deck all the way back in 2003, so it's no wonder the card was banned. Could Oath of Druids be unbanned? This is a soft yes. While it is a very strong combo, it's not that much stronger than what's going on in the format right now. Combo decks have gotten a lot stronger over the years. The deck's cousin, Show and Tell, has fallen off pretty hard and isn't really all that great anymore. Another deck built around cheating cards into play, Reanimator, is also doing pretty poorly right now due to how weak the card is to graveyard hate. This deck is a lot stronger than those, so it would disrupt the meta game a bit, but it wouldn't break the format. Additionally, we should mention that right now, Oath of Druids is doing worse than Doomsday combo decks in Vintage, and Doomsday is currently legal in Legacy. These are different metagames, but it shouldn't be way too strong simply on a power level basis. Rather, it would just introduce a new archetype to the format that would shake up the metagame, and most people think the Legacy could use a shakeup nowadays anyway. How could Oath of Druids be fixed to be unbanned? This card is probably fine, so it doesn't necessarily need to be fixed. Next up, we have Time Vault. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It has the abilities where it enters the battlefield tapped. It doesn't untap during your untap step. If you would begin a turn and Time Vault is tapped, you can instead skip the turn and untap Time Vault. And you can tap Time Vault to take an extra turn after this one. This card was banned in September of 2008. So, why was Time Vault banned? As it turns out, there were simply far too many ways to get around the downsides of Time Vault. There are cards like Voltaic Key, a 1-mana artifact that lets you pay 1 and tap it to untap target artifact. With Time Vault, this reads play 1 and tap to take an extra turn. Since this is a cost you can easily pay every turn, this allows you to take infinite turns. Once you do that, you just won the game. Just about anything will let you win from there. You could be playing Flying Men and it would be enough to close the game for you. Any card that makes it so that your opponent will literally never get another turn is obviously pretty strong. And Time Vault doesn't really ask for much. 2 mana is a very small investment, and you don't really give anything up to play this card. Similar with Oath of Druids, this card doesn't really require you to play a ton of other cards in your deck. You could theoretically slam both these cards into any deck and just kind of win the game sometimes. Though, if you're playing this card, it's usually the centerpiece of your strategy. This combo was incredibly hard to beat when it was released, so it's no wonder the card needed to be banned. Could Time Vault be unbanned? This is another no, but it's very, very close, at least on power level. While this card is very strong in Vintage, it's worth noting that the support cards of the deck are all banned in Legacy. The deck does get a lot worse with Tinker ban. Now, while this does make the deck worse, Time Vault is kind of the de facto best combo in the game. Taking infinite turns is just too strong, and the lack of any real cost outside of a small mana investment means that it's hard to get blown out by. There are enough anti-artifact cards like Stony Silence and Null Rod that the meta could probably survive the cards unbanning, but that's not the only consideration here. You see, Time Vault is a reserved list card, and quite the pricey one at that. Legacy is a very expensive format, but the cost of this card would be far too high for most players, and that's at its current price. It would likely get a lot pricier if it was unbanned, and without Wizards being able to reprint the card, it would never get less expensive. So the card likely is going to stay banned more to keep Legacy at least a little accessible on paper, and unbanning it isn't really necessary. So how could Time Vault be fixed to be unbanned? This is a little bit interesting, as Time Vault has gone through multiple erratas to fix the card. Originally, the card worked the way it does today, but in April of 1996, the card was changed. It was changed so that you could skip your next turn and put a time counter on it to untap Time Vault. Then you would need to tap it to remove the time counter for it to take the extra turn. The card then went through multiple erratas, but it was eventually returned to its original functionality. Wizards doesn't really like power level erratas and tries to avoid them as much as they can. Still, this solution does work, though it nerfs the card a bit too much. There's not a great fix besides increasing the mana cost. At 4 or 5 mana, the card is expensive enough that would probably be fine, though possibly still a viable combo in Legacy. In this series, we'll go over the Legacy ban list and explain what got the cards banned, and if they need to stay banned. We're going to go over a few combo cards today, explaining how they were used and if they could be unbanned. Starting us off, we have Bazaar Baghdad. This is a land with the ability where you can tap it to draw 2 cards and then discard 3 cards. This card was banned in September of 2004. Why was Bazaar Baghdad banned? As it turns out, this card was way too good at filling your graveyard with cards. There are tons of cards in Magic like Irkorid, which can return themselves in the graveyard to the battlefield for free if you manage to put enough cards in your graveyard to fuel them. Even better, you can combine with the incredibly powerful Dredge mechanic. This is a mechanic where, whenever you would draw a card, you instead mill a number of cards equal to the Dredge number and put that Dredge card from your graveyard into your hand. With Bazaar, you could tap it to draw 2 cards, allowing you to Dredge 2 from your graveyard and mill up to 12 cards. Then you can discard 3 cards from your hand, allowing you to put those Dredge cards back into your graveyard to dredge them back next turn. You could also combine with cards like Bastion Ridwalla, a card with the Madness cost of 0. Madness means that whenever you discard this card, you cast it for its Madness cost. So whenever you discard Ridwalla, you get to cast a free creature. There's a ton of different graveyard cards you could use with Bazaar. Now, while every time you tap the Bazaar, you did lose some card advantage, the raw power of being able to move so many cards around and put so many cards into your graveyard made this card insanely powerful. The card advantage doesn't matter when your graveyard might as well be your hand. Bazaar was simply way too strong with graveyard effects, and has only ever gotten stronger as Magic has gone on and more graveyard effects have gotten printed. Could Bazaar be unbanned? No, absolutely not. Graveyard decks aren't currently at the top of the metagame, but Bazaar would be enough to change that. There really isn't much of a difference between the graveyard cards at legal in Legacy and legal in Vintage, and Bazaar-based graveyard decks are currently easily the second best deck in the metagame. Seeing that Bazaar is the only really important missing piece in Legacy, Bazaar getting unbanned would make them the best or second best deck easily. How could Bazaar be fixed to be unbanned? Something like actually putting a mana cost and activate the ability would help. Making it cost as little as 1 mana would fix the card. For a long time, lots of graveyard decks ran Bazaar as their only land because it was simply that good. Making it cost even 1 mana would be a major nerf to it. It would be enough to make it unbannable, but the card would still be very strong. Next up, we have Channel. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 green. It has the effect where, for the rest of the turn, anytime you could activate a mana ability, you can pay 1 life to add 1 colorless mana. This card was banned in March of 1994, and that ban carried on into Legacy. Why was Channel banned? Channel was actually part of the very first combo in all of Magic. How the combo worked was you would use Black Lotus, a 0 mana artifact that you could tap to sack to add 3 mana of any one color to add 3 green mana. You would use this to make 19 colorless mana with Channel. Then you would use a second Black Lotus to make a red mana, and then you would cast Fireball, a card that would deal X damage to any target, where X was how much mana you paid. By putting 21 mana into Fireball, you could kill your opponent on turn 1. And Channel and Lotus had made more than enough mana to let you do this. This was the very first combo in all of Magic, and it was a huge problem at that point in the game. You see, at this point, there actually wasn't a playset limit in the game. So people just played 20 copies of Channels, 20 copies of Fireballs, and 20 Black Lotuses, and were able to draw into this combo basically every game. Considering how consistent and powerful this combo was, the only real solution to the issue was to make some major changes. So, Wizards acted by introducing a playset limit of 4 for every card besides basic lands, and banned Channel for good measure. The combo still would have been viable, and without cards like Force of Will at this point in the game, it still could have led to fairly consistent turn 1 kills, with no way for your opponent to respond. Considering how many turn 1 kills the card enabled, the card has been and has stayed banned for most of the history of the game. Could Channel be unbanned? Surprisingly, yes. It would be a new combo deck in Legacy, but it would have more than its fair share of counterplay. Most of the busted fast mana that enabled it is, and will stay, banned. So you usually have to wait until turn 2 or 3 to get your Channel combo off. Turn 1 kills won't be any more consistent or resilient than other turn 1 kills in the format, and honestly, the payoff for the card might not be there. Fireballing your opponent doesn't seem that practical with how the math works out, as you often won't have enough life to kill your opponent, not to mention how weak it is to cards like Lightning Bolt. Now that cards like Force of Will, Force of Negation, and Daze are out and heavily played in Legacy, the game has kind of caught up to Channel in its power level. How could this card be fixed to be unbanned? As previously stated, the card is probably fine. Next up, we have Demonic Consultation. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 black. It has the effect where you choose a card name, then you exile the top 6 cards of your deck. You exile the cards on top of your deck until you exile the named card, and you put that card into your hand. This card was banned in September of 2000. Why was Demonic Consultation banned? Most of the time, Consultation was just an instant speed version of Demonic Tutor. The downside of exiling random cards from your deck usually wasn't enough to stop the card from being really strong, though it is a real downside in a lot of situations. Since you named the card first, you could get very unlucky and exile your entire deck if the first 6 cards you hit are all your copies of the card you named. As a result, people usually only name a card they have 4 copies of to make sure they don't accidentally just kill themselves. However, in recent times, a new card has come out that has made this card even stronger, namely Thassa's Oracle, which will win you the game if it enters the battlefield if you have no cards in your library. With this, Consultation can not only find you key cards whenever you need them, it can actually be one of your combo pieces. You see, by naming a card not in your deck, Consultation will just exile your entire library, allowing you to win off of Oracle whenever you play it. This didn't end up factoring into why the card was initially banned, as it was just a 1-mana tutor in the old days of Magic, but it is important for seeing why the card might need to stay banned. Could Demonic Consultation be unbanned? No. Demonic Tutor is already too good for Legacy, and Consultation is better than Demonic Tutor in a lot of circumstances, thanks to being able to be a combo piece as well. If you compare it to Vampiric Tutor, it becomes even more obvious why the card needs to stay banned. Unbanning the card would spring entirely new dominant decks into being and make combo decks far too good in the format. How could Demonic Consultation be fixed to be unbanned? Wizards has already found a way to do this with the card Tainted Pact. This is a 2-mana instant that allows you to exile the top card of your library, then you can put it into your hand unless you exiled another card with the same name this way. Then you repeat this process until you either exile 2 cards of the same name, or put a card into your hand. This card has a lot of the same ideas as Tainted Pact, as it's a risky tutor to cast, but it can have a high payoff. However, restricting how you build your deck this way makes it so that it can't be quite as strong as a tutor or as a combo piece. Alternatively, you could always just bump up the mana cost. Next up, we have Earthcraft. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has the ability where you can tap an untapped creature you control to untap target basic land. This card was banned in March of 2003. Why was Earthcraft banned? The issue was that there was ways to go infinite and win the game on the spot. One of the most famous is Squirrel Nest, an aura with an enchant land that gives the enchanted land the ability to tap to create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token. So, what you would do is tap the basic land with Nest on it to make a squirrel, then use the squirrel to activate Earthcraft, untapping the land that the Nest is enchanting, then you simply just repeat this infinitely and you swarm the board with tons of squirrels and kill your opponent next turn. This is one of the multiple uses for the card, but it's one of the easiest ways to take advantage of the card. Another way to use it is to combine it with Nettle Sentinel and Glimpse of Nature. Sentinel is a 2/2 for 1 green with the ability where you untap it whenever you cast a green spell, but it doesn't untap normally. Glimpse is a 1-mana sorcerer that allows you to draw a card each time you cast a creature spell for the rest of the turn. By using Earthcraft, you can tap your Sentinel to untap a land, use the mana to cast a creature spell, letting you draw a new card and getting your mana back. This can let you get some pretty crazy turns, getting a huge board and sometimes winning the game right there. Now, this is only one of the few ways you can take advantage of the card, but all of them together made Wizards think the card was too good. Could Earthcraft be unbanned? Yes, easily. These combos are much weaker than a lot of the other combos currently legal in Legacy. Elves don't really need the card, and it's doubtful whether they'd want to play it given the fact that Elves decks are trimming their Glimpse packages in favor of a better fair game. All in all, Earthcraft just doesn't have a home. Next, we have Fastbound. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 green. It has the abilities where you can play any number of lands on each of your turns. It also has the ability where, whenever you play a land, if it wasn't the first land you played this turn, Fastbound deals 1 damage to you. This card was banned in 1996. So, why was Fastbound banned? It turns out, being able to play a ton of lands is really strong. This card basically turns all of your lands into Moxen, as you can just play as many as you want, getting a ton of mana right away. There's not necessarily one combo with Fastbound that broke it, as land-heavy decks were pretty busted with it on their own. But there were a few cards that were really broken with it. Zuran Orb is a 0-mana artifact with the ability where you can sacrifice a land to gain 2 life. Ramunap Excavator is a 2/3 for 3 with the ability where you can play land cards from your graveyard. What you can do is play a land, tap it, and then sacrifice it with Orb. Then you can repeat the process because Excavator allows you to play it from your graveyard. This can allow you to make infinite mana and gain infinite life, but you can make this even better. Once you have infinite mana and life, you can use a card like Horizon Canopy to draw a card, repeating a similar loop. Now, while this is a good use for the card, Fastbound is one of those cards where the combos aren't really the only reason to play the card. Just getting to get 4 or so mana on one turn is great for any deck, and there are quite a few decks that are built around lands in Legacy. The eponymous lands decks will usually play worse versions of the card like Exploration or Manabound, and they would love to have Fastbound come back. Overall, Fastbound was just way too strong and powered up way too many land-based strategies. So, could Fastbound be unbanned? The answer to this is probably no. The card is just way too good, and a lot of the decks that it would make better don't really need the help. Lands is already a good deck, and giving it another piece of crazy support would make it too good and make it really hard for the decks to compete with. How could Fastbound be fixed to be unbanned? Letting you play any number of lands on your turn is just way too good of an ability, and there's not really a way to fix this without restricting the number of lands you can play off of it. Paying 1 life just isn't close to a high enough cost. If you had to do something far much harsher, like discard a card, it would be a lot closer. It would still be strong, but at least it would be a little bit more balanced. And to wrap up this video, we're going to go over a few cards that weren't banned for power level reasons. Chaos Orb, Falling Star, and Shahrazad, which are all banned in every format of Magic simply because they're too incompatible with the game's designs as a competitive game. Starting with Chaos Orb, this is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It has the ability where you can pay 1 and tap it to flip Chaos Orb over the table from a height of at least 1 foot, and then destroy each permanent it's touching. Then you destroy Chaos Orb. Falling Star is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. Similar to Chaos Orb, it requires you to flip it over the table at least 1 foot in the air, then it deals 3 damage to each creature it lands on, and you tap all those creatures. Finally, Shahrazad is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 white. It has the ability where the players play a subgame of Magic using their libraries as their decks, then each player who doesn't win the subgame loses half their life. Chaos Orb and Falling Star were banned in November of 1995, and Shahrazad was banned in December of 2007. So, why were these cards banned? As I said earlier, they go against Magic's design as a competitive game. The issue with Chaos Orb and Star is that not only do they test skill that no other card tests, they also cause a whole host of logistical issues. The best counterplay for these cards is to play their cards as far apart as possible, so that they can't touch more than one of your permanents. This would cause a huge issue at tournaments, as players would take up far too much room at their tables. These issues enough are good enough reason to ban the cards. Shahrazad was banned simply because it's a headache to deal with. The card makes games take way too long to finish. In tournament settings especially, this is a huge issue, as it can easily stall tournaments to a halt. It can also be used to stall games for a draw, something that no one really wants to play against when they go to a tournament. All these issues combined lead to the cards just being banned. Could these cards be unbanned? No. Not at all. The logistical issues they pose are still there, and honestly, no one really wants to deal with them in a tournament setting. The cards would need to be changed substantially to be able to come back. How could these cards be fixed to be unbanned? Chaos Orb and Falling Star would need to have their mechanics changed to simply randomly select cards and destroy or deal damage to them. This would fix their issues, though it would also kind of ruin the fun of the cards. as you couldn't really get good at using them like you could with the original versions. Shahrazad basically can't be fixed without entirely scrapping the card. The payoff doesn't really matter, nor does the cost. Playing a second game just is a mechanic that really should be allowed to exist in the game. First off, we have Library of Alexandria. This is a land you can tap for one colorless. It has the ability where you can tap Library to draw a card, but only if you have exactly 7 cards in your hand. This card was restricted back in May of 1994 before Legacy was formalized as a format, and it's stayed on the ban list ever since. Why was Library of Alexandria banned? This card is just too good at drawing you too many cards and had basically no drawbacks whatsoever. These sort of utility lands trade in the ability to make colored mana for the ability to give you something else and have often been very strong. If your deck can afford to rely on the generic mana it produces, you essentially get the ability it gives you with no downsides at all. While this in of itself makes the utility land strong, what the lands give you in return is very important. Drawing a card, for example, is an incredibly strong effect, usually considered one of the strongest effects in the game. Now, having to have a full hand to activate the ability is a very harsh restriction that makes getting any actual value out of Library fairly difficult. However, if you open with a Library, you can usually be smart about playing out cards from your hand, and when you activate Library to start at around 7 cards. And even if you can only activate it 2 or 3 times, that's still a huge amount of value to get for basically no cost. You're basically paying 1 mana for a card every time you activate the ability, which is way above rate for a card that you can activate multiple times. Cards that let you draw on a mana sink are usually priced very highly to stop them from being too strong in the late game. But this is priced competitively with cantrips, cards that cost 1 mana and draw you a card on top of doing something else. The thing is, cantrips aren't card advantage because you have to give up an entire card to use them, but Library is. It sticks around on the battlefield no matter what, so if you only draw 1 card off of it, you're still 1 card up. So how Library usually worked is you drew it early, you would get to draw way more cards than your opponent and would quickly run away with the game. However, if they drew it late, it would just be another land to help them cast their spells. Library was a card that would steal games that would basically never cost you anything, so it made slow, control-oriented decks far too strong and hard to beat. Could Library of Alexandria be unbanned? This is a soft yes. Library is often remembered as one of the strongest cards in Magic, and that is true, and in most formats, the card would still be far too strong. In a format like Modern, Library would be way too good and would invalidate most non-Library decks. However, Legacy is a format where it's very poorly suited. First off, most cards are so cheap and efficient that Library can't help you cast them. A huge number of the cards you want to cast in Legacy only have colored mana in their costs. This means that Library, unlike in most formats, actually has a deck building cost. You can see this with other similar cards like Wasteland. Any Delver player will tell you that Wasteland isn't a land in your deck, it's a spell that takes up your land drop, since it basically doesn't help you cast any of your spells. Since the downside of Library is far higher in that format, the upside has to be much higher as well. However, in Legacy, players are usually forced to use the cards in their hands so quickly that staying at 7 cards in hand isn't practical. If you aren't a combo deck trying to win on turn 1, you're using cards like Force of Will to stop your opponent. So, due to the specific metagame of Legacy, Library wouldn't really do anything if it were unbanned. Now, while Library could be unbanned and not do anything, Library is a card that is only ever useless or completely broken. It's very likely to stay banned because Wizards would only view it as a potential risk in the format that might simply need to be banned again later on anyway. Now, while the card doesn't really need to be fixed, it's also worth mentioning that Wizards has already released nerfed versions of the card. For example, cards like Bibelplex are heavily nerfed versions of the card with similar restrictions. Next up, we have Balance. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. It has the effect where each player chooses a number of lands equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controlled the least and then sacrifices the rest. Then each player discards cards and then sacrifices creatures the same way. This card was restricted in Vintage in April of 1995 and hit an extended in July of 1997, and was therefore banned when Legacy was created. Now, why was Balance banned? Balance was banned due to its ability to essentially get rid of all of your opponent's resources, or literally get rid of all of them in the best case scenario. You see, if you don't have any lands, creatures, or cards in hand, you can cast a Balance to get rid of all of your opponent's lands, creatures, and cards in their hand. This may seem difficult, as you would need to somehow play all the cards in your hand while not putting any lands or creatures on board, not to mention somehow find the mana to play Balance itself. However, there are a few ways to make this a lot easier. First off, there are a few card types that Balance misses. It doesn't hit artifacts, enchantments, or planeswalkers while they're on board. The most useful of these for Balance are artifacts. You see, there are a ton of artifacts that cost 0 mana, which allow you to empty your hand quickly. Even better, there are cards like Chrome Mox that cost 0 mana and can produce mana. This lets you get the mana to cast Balance without playing any lands. So if you draw a Balance, a few mana produces a ton of 0 mana cards, you could empty your hand and cast a Balance to get your opponent to sack all their lands, discard their entire hand, and get rid of any creatures they have. After that, you'll be in a top deck war with your opponent, but you'll have cards in play, so you'll already be ahead to draw the extra cards off of your baubles. so you'll usually be able to pull pretty far ahead and win the game. In fact, balance has actually gotten stronger nowadays, since now that planeswalkers exist, you can pretty easily stick one and then resolve a balance and be so far ahead of your opponent that you'll almost certainly win. Now, this combo scenario is very strong, but the card can be extremely strong in a variety of situations. Even if you drop late into the game, it can leave you very far ahead if you build your deck around it. Due to how this card could simply win games on its own so easily, the card needed to be banned. Could balance be unbanned? This is another yes. The thing is, getting balance to go off and get rid of all your opponent's cards is basically just worse than the other combos already legal in Legacy. So the real question is if it would work as part of a more fair strategy, and unfortunately, there's a lot of things holding it back. Without the original Moxen or other fast mana run around, getting balance to be the one-side Armageddon is very difficult. If you want to use it as a board wipe or as a discard spell, you have to make sure you're low on those things yourself, and decks would really have a hard time getting this to work. It's not like the card would be bad or see no play, but it wouldn't break the format. Next up, we have Mental Misstep. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 Phyrexian blue mana, which can be paid by either blue mana or 2 life. It has the effect where you counter target spell with mana value of 1. This card was banned in September of 2011. Why was Mental Misstep banned? We've discussed this card before when going over the modern ban lists, and everything that made it too good in modern is true in Legacy, but even more so. You see, the problem with Misstep is that basically every deck in Magic has quite a few 1 mana value cards, and the stronger a format is, the more cheap cards people are playing. For example, Izzet Delver is currently the best deck in Legacy, and a huge amount of the cards in the deck are 1 mana spells. Mental Misstep would be able to stop a huge number of cards in the deck for basically no cost at all, and this extends to a ton of decks in Legacy. However, the worst thing about Misstep is the fact that Misstep is the best answer to itself. Misstep is a 1 mana value spell, so if you're trying to protect your plays from your opponent, the best thing you could do is play a playset of Missteps yourself. This leads to a situation where basically every deck was jamming as many Missteps as they could to try and counter all the Missteps everyone else was playing. Due to the fact this card was simply too good in basically every deck, the card was banned to introduce more diversity to Legacy. Could Mental Misstep be unbanned? No. The format is still too dependent on 1 mana spells, and Misstep being unbanned would still lead to a completely saturating the metagame. Not to mention the card would be extremely powerful in Izzet Delver, which is already the best deck in Legacy. How could Mental Misstep be fixed to be unbanned? The card needs to cost actual mana to cast. Making it cost 1 and 1 Phyrexian blue would fix all of the card's problems. Next up, we have Oko, Thief of Crowns. This is a planeswalker with a mana cost of 1, 1 green, and 1 blue. It has a starting loyalty of 4, and the abilities where you can +2 him to create a food token, which is an artifact token that you can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice to gain 3 life. You can +1 him to have target artifact or creature become a 3/3 green elf creature with no abilities, and you can -5 him to exchange control of target artifact or creature you control and target creature your opponent controls with power 3 or less. This card was banned in February of 2021. Now, why was Oko banned? We've talked about Oko a lot on this channel, but the basic gist is that it's too good at making you a board and at answering your opponent's threats. Basically, how Oko worked is if your opponent played anything threatening, you can +1 him to target it to essentially get rid of it. If your opponent wasn't playing anything that you want to get rid of, you'd +2 him to make a food, and then +1 him next turn to target your own food to turn it into a 3/3. This basically makes Oko a combination of a removal spell and a creature factory at the same time, letting it very easily take over a board state. Worst of all, it did all this while gaining loyalty the entire time, making it almost impossible to remove, and even more difficult to remove without losing card advantage. All of this combined made Oko one of the strongest planeswalkers in all of Magic. Oko warped Legacy around it pretty significantly, seeing a ton of play and pushing the decks that could make use of it to the forefront of the metagame. Due to how overwhelming its power was, Wizards banned the card. Now, could Oko be unbanned? This is a very soft no. Legacy has gotten a lot stronger over the past year and change, especially when it comes to the power of fair strategies. The metagame would have a much easier time adjusting to Oko than it did when it was banned, however, it's still not necessarily safe to unban. One of the biggest issues with the card is actually just how much the community dislikes it, which would make unbanning the card very unpopular regardless of the actual impact it had on the metagame. If you combine the negative opinion of the community with the potential for the wins to change in the format and Oko to push out other fair strategies, and it does seem like unbanning Oko would mostly just be a bad thing. How could Oko be fixed to be unbanned? The numbers of the loyalty abilities just need to be adjusted. Making a food should only be a +1, and the ability to elk something should be a 0 or maybe even a -1. This would make killing Oko way easier and give other fair decks a much easier time to deal with it. Next, we have Dreadhorde Arcanist. This is a 1/3 zombie wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to the defending player or planeswalker while attacking, and it has the ability where, whenever it attacks, you can cast target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard with mana value equal to or less than its power without paying its mana cost. But if it would be put into the graveyard this turn, you exile it instead. This card was banned in February 2021 at the same time as Oko. Now, why was Dreadhorde Arcanist banned? This card was banned due to being far too strong in his Delver decks. As I said earlier, most of the deck spells cost 1 mana, so you don't have to pump up its power to recast most of the deck's instants and sorceries. Every time Dreadhorde attacks, you'll get to recast a cantrip like Ponder to draw more cards, or recast cards like Lightning Bolt to either deal with threats or burn your opponent to death. This is extremely powerful in Delver decks because it gives the deck an incredibly long game that it wouldn't really have otherwise. While Delver does have tons of cantrips to find his most important cards, it doesn't really have many cards that actually get it card advantage, the only real one being Expressive Iteration. Combine that with a deck leaning on cards like Force of Will that lose you card advantage to help it fight for the control of the game, and the deck can sometimes have trouble running out of cards in the late game. Dreadhorde made the deck way too good at drawing cards and staying around for the late game, which made the deck extremely hard to beat. Due to how this card shored up one of the few weaknesses that the best deck in the format had, Wizards banned the card to help give other decks more room to breathe. Could Dreadhorde Arcanist be unbanned? No, as that Delver is still the best deck in Legacy, and there's no reason to make it even better. The deck already has an issue of having too strong of a late game due to Expressive Iteration and Murktide Regent giving the deck more staying power, so giving them another strong advantage piece would make the format even worse. How could Dreadhorde Arcanist be fixed to be unbanned? Bumping up the mana cost to 1 and 2 red would slow it down enough that the card wouldn't be broken anymore, though it would be pretty bad at that point. And finally, we have Strip Mine. This is a land with the abilities where you can tap it to add 1 colorless mana, or tap it and sacrifice it to destroy target land. This card was banned in October of 1996. Now, why was Strip Mine banned? The issue is that this card is just way too good at making it impossible for your opponent to play. One of the most important cards in Legacy is Wasteland, which is a fixed version of Strip Mine that can only destroy non-basic lands. Wasteland is used to punish greedy mana bases and can often win the game on its own. If your opponent keeps a hand with only non-basic lands, you can potentially destroy all their lands with Wasteland, leaving them entirely unable to play the game. Even if you can't completely shut them down, making them play with 1 fewer lands than they thought they would have can often make it impossible to cast the cards they want. Strip Mine takes this a step further by taking away pretty much all forms of counterplay. Against Wasteland, you can play more basics or fetch center protect your mana bases from your opponent. But with Strip Mine, you're going to lose your lands eventually. Even worse, by using cards like Rabbit Up Excavator, you can keep playing your Strip Mine every turn to eventually run your opponent out of lands completely. The combination of the fact that there's just no counterplay to the card at all and how powerful the card can be, the card was banned. Could Strip Mine be unbanned? No, not even close. Again, there's realistically no real counterplay to the card at all, and considering how the card can just win you games or even matches, having a card like this in the format would be pretty terrible. Not to mention how it would push out a ton of slower strategies out of the format entirely. How could Strip Mine be fixed to be unbanned? The card has been retrained tons of times. Wasteland is basically the same card, but with a single restriction. Cards like Ghost Quarter and Tectonic Edge are also fixed versions of the cards, so the fixed version of Strip Mines already exists. We have Deathrite Shaman. This is a 1/2 elf shaman with the mana cost of black-green hybrid mana. It has the abilities where you can tap it to exile a target land from your graveyard to add 1 mana of any color. You can pay 1 green and tap it to exile a target creature card from graveyard and gain 2 life, and you can pay 1 black and tap it to exile a target instant or sorcery card from a graveyard to make each opponent lose 2 life. This card was banned in July of 2018. Why was this card banned? Well, this card was banned for largely the same reasons it was in the modern format. Cards like Birds of Paradise were considered powerful for its ability to ramp you while also fixing your colors. Deathrite is basically a way better version of Bop in every single way. It has better stats, an easier mana cost to cast, and has 2 very useful abilities that Bird doesn't have. The only downside is the card is needed to have lands to exile. However, since fetch lands are so powerful, this is never an issue. This mana fixing allowed the deck to play up to 4 colors with basically no way for your opponent to punish them. And on top of this mana fixing, Shaman was also a very useful creature in a ton of matchups. Able to push out more damage, give you more life, and deal with threats in the graveyard. Now, this is all basically the same as what the card did in Modern, where it's also banned. Shaman actually stayed around for 4 more years in Legacy because the format was more powerful than Modern, and was more able to handle the card's power. Still, eventually, the meta was just bent around the card too much, so Wizards banned it. Could Deathrite Shaman be unbanned? This is a soft no, but it's a bit close. It's a bit up in the air exactly what decks, if any, would be interested in Shaman right now. The card's most common home has been Delver of Secrets or Death Shadow decks. It's debatable about whether or not these decks would switch from their streamlined 2-color variants to the more powerful but more clunky 4-color variants of the deck. There are also various other more fair decks I would consider running the card. While it's hard to say what the impact of unbanning the card would be, the most likely result is making the best deck of the format even better, so unbanning the card seems very silly. How could Deathrite Shaman be fixed to be unbanned? First off, the mana cost needs to require green mana. Being a hybrid mana cost makes the card too easy to cast. It might need some other nerfs, like increasing the cost of its other activated abilities, but it should be fine by just being restricted to green. Next up, we have Gitaxian Probe. This is a source with a mana cost of 1 Phyrexian blue, meaning you can pay it with either 1 blue or 2 life. It has the effect where you look at target player's hand and then draw a card. This card was banned at the same time as Deathrite in July of 2018. Why was Gitaxian Probe banned? The big issue is that the card just doesn't have any cost. 2 life usually doesn't matter, and the card cycles, meaning most of the time when you cast Gitaxian Probe, you're just up for information. This can be really good for combo decks, as it allows you to check your opponent's hand for interaction and allow you to play around whatever they have. However, making this card even better is the fact that there are tons of synergies and interactions that make the card even better. For example, casting a Probe ups your Storm count, allowing your Storm cards to copy themselves in additional time. However, even small synergies can go a long way with a card like Probe. For example, one of the best threats in Legacy is Dragon Rage Channeler, who has the ability where whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you look at the top card of your library, then put it on top of your library or into your graveyard. This turns Probe from a cycle into basically a Consider, which is a card that a ton of decks play in weaker formats for its ability to help you find the right cards and fill up your graveyard. However, while these synergies aren't even necessary, sometimes just getting to check your opponent's hand for interactions is so strong that it will completely change the tide of the game. Due to how this card made combo decks far harder to interact with, Wizards banned the card. Can Gitaxian Probe be unbanned? This is a no. The combo decks really don't need this kind of boost, as it would just make it really hard for decks to interact with them. This would really push out a ton of fair decks that can't afford to run a huge amount of free interaction to stop these combos. How could Probe be fixed to be unbanned? This card just needs to not cast for Phyrexian mana. As seen with cards like Street Wraith, a 0 mana cycle is an incredibly strong effect. Getting any extra value on top of that makes it way too easy to break the card. Next up, we have Lurrus of the Dream Den. This is a 3/2 legendary cat nightmare with a mana cost of 1 and 2 hybrid black-white mana. It has Companion. Your starting deck contains no permanents with a mana value greater than 2. This means that you can reveal this card from your sideboard at the start of the game if you meet its Companion requirement. Then you pay 3 mana during your main phase later on to put Lurrus from your sideboard into your hand. It has lifelink, meaning it dealing damage causes you to gain that much life. It also has the ability where you can cast a permanent spell with a mana value of 2 or less from your graveyard on each of your turns. This card was banned in May of 2020. Why was Lurrus banned? Well, Lurrus is a pretty infamous card, as are all 10 of the companions for that matter. Lurrus on its own is a fine card. Its stat line is okay, but being able to play a card from your graveyard every turn was extremely strong. This basically gets you a free card every turn. However, since you get to choose what card to cast, you actually get a good degree of card selection too. This wouldn't be enough to get the card banned, but the companion ability completely broke the card. First off, getting around the companion requirement is basically free. Most of the cards you want to play in a format like Legacy either cost 2 or less mana or aren't permanents. The only exceptions are delve threats like Murktide Regent, but that's an acceptable loss for getting so much card advantage. 6 mana is a lot to get the card out. Since you know you'll get so much card advantage late game, you can afford to expand resources to slow your opponent down. Once you get Lurrus down, you'll usually start running away with the game. Now, the thing that made the card so bannable was the fact that basically every deck could play it for no cost. Since all the permanents cost so little and the upside of playing Lurrus was so high, it slotted into almost every deck. The card was so widespread that the ban was basically a foregone conclusion. Could Lurrus be unbanned? No. All the same problems still exist. The Delver is still the best deck and could still play the card, though they might need to rethink about whether or not it's quite worth it, and there are a ton of other decks like Death Shadow decks that could also use the card to great effect. How could Lurrus be fixed to be unbanned? You have to remove the Companion ability. We've gone over this before and will again, but the Companion ability is just too powerful. Next up, we have Zirda the Dawnwaker. This is a 3/3 legendary elemental fox with a mana cost of 1 and 2 hybrid white-red mana. It has Companion. Each permanent card in your starting deck has an activated ability. It has the ability where the abilities you activate that aren't mana abilities cost 2 less to activate, and this can't reduce the cost to less than 1 mana. It also has the ability where you can pay 1 and tap it to prevent target creature from blocking this turn. This card was banned in May of 2020. Why was Zirda banned? Well, the card was actually part of a 2-card combo. You see, there was a card called Basalt Monolith with the ability where you can tap it for 3 colorless, and then you can pay 3 to untap it, and it doesn't untap in your untap step. With Zirda out, the ability to untap it will only cost 1 mana, meaning you can tap it for mana, get 3 mana, use 1 to untap it, getting an untapped monolith with 2 mana left over. This will let you produce infinite mana. Once you have infinite mana, you could use it to cast a spell like Walking Ballista to ping your opponent to death. This slotted perfectly into a deck called Bomberman, a deck that tried to use Salvagers with Lion's Eyes Diamonds to make infinite mana to win in largely the same way. The thing is, since Zirda was a companion, you could start the game with it in your command zone. meaning your 3-card combo goes down to a 2-card combo. This was extremely problematic, especially since it was very hard to interact with companions, so Wizards banned the card to stop this combo from being problematic. Could this card be unbanned? This one is another no. Letting these decks have a combo where one half of the combo just can't be interacted with outside of a counterspell is just way too much for the format. There's also the issue that it's a companion, and the fan base just hates companions. So everyone kind of wants the card to stay banned regardless of how good it actually is. How could this card be fixed to be unbanned? Again, just remove the companion ability. Next up, we have Mana Drain. This is an instant with the mana cost of 2 blue with the effect where you counter target spell, then it becomes the beginning of your next pre-combat main phase. You add an amount of colorless mana equal to that spell's mana value. This card was banned in September of 2004. Why was Mana Drain banned? Well, Mana Drain was kind of just a counterspell with a crazy upside attached to it. Counterself itself is a very strong card, and there aren't that many 2-mana unconditional counters in Magic. This has led to the card seeing a ton of play in Legacy throughout the years, though its usage has been slowly decreasing over time. So we have a card that's already playable, and we've given it an upside. So just how good is Mana Drain's ability to give you extra mana? Well, it's pretty crazy. Getting 2 or 3 extra mana to use on your turn can let you do some pretty absurd things. For example, if your opponent casts a 3-drop and you Mana Drain it, on your next turn you'll have 6 mana to use, assuming you went second. With all that mana, you can either play a game-ending threat, or play 2 3-drops, or some other combination of cards. This will allow you to get incredibly far ahead on board or play a powerful draw spell without giving up any tempo. These sorts of ritual effects are often very strong, but usually only in very specific decks. For example, as crazy as Dark Ritual is, it basically only sees play in combo decks. However, since Mana Drain is just a strictly better counterspell, you can run in all matter of decks and try to get a huge blow-off of it. Interestingly, this is a card that was buffed a lot by rules changes, specifically the removal of mana burn. This was a mechanic where whenever mana emptied from a player's mana pool, that player would lose that much life. This rule was removed because it was largely superfluous, but with cards like Mana Drain, it ended up making them a lot better. It used to be that if you couldn't spend the mana that Mana Drain gave you, you'd end up taking damage, but now it's all upside. So, since this card was too good, Wizards banned the card. Could Mana Drain be unbanned? This is actually a yes. You see, Legacy has changed a lot since Mana Drain's ban. There are a few issues with Mana Drain nowadays. First off, most of the spells you'll be casting won't cost that much mana. The majority of spells in Legacy cost 1 or 2 mana at most, so you really aren't getting anything off of the card. Sure, a lot of decks do have some super expensive cards, but it's not that common, and you'll often have to use Mana Drain on very cheap spells. This isn't the biggest deal, but it does make the card worse, as you're not getting anywhere near as much value off of the card. Secondly, since the spells players are cast in Legacy are so cheap, the colorless Mana Drain gives you often won't even do anything. Lots of blue decks will have hands with basically no generic mana in the cost of their cards. You could play some more expensive cards to get more value off a Drain, but that's definitely not worth it, especially since you aren't getting the blowouts you want. The final issue is that nowadays, Counterspell is kind of a bad card in Legacy. Sure, the card is serviceable, but there are much better options available, and most blue decks opt to run as many free counters as they can so they don't have to try and leave up mana for their opponent's turn. Basically, Mana Drain's upsides aren't anywhere near as big as the deals they used to be, and the floor of the card has gotten to the point where there's just no reason to use it over better options. Next up, we have Memory Jar. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 5. It is the ability where you can tap it and sacrifice it to make each player exile their hand face down and then draw 7 cards. And then at the end of the turn, each player discards their hand and returns all cards exiled by Memory Jar to their hand. This card was banned in March of 1999. Why was Memory Jar banned? This card was pretty infamous for being the first emergency ban in the history of Magic the Gathering. You see, after the March 1999 ban list release, it came to light just how broken the card would be. So they had to retroactively add Jar to the list. Why was this? Well, Memory Jar was included in Urza's block, one of the most broken blocks in all of Magic. This set included cards like Sarah's Sanctum, Gaia's Cradle, and Tolarian Academy, lands that you could tap to add 1 mana of each color for each permanent you controlled of a certain type. The best was Tolarian Academy, as it was very easy to flood the board with tons of artifacts when compared to other card types. Then you could use cards like Turnabout to untap each land or artifact you control, or play a card like Bind Over Matter to repeatedly discard a hand to untap your Academy. With all of these ways to make tons of mana, all you needed was a way to draw more cards, and Memory Jar was great at doing this. For a measly 5 mana, this could let you draw a full new hand of 7 cards. By combining this with other incredibly powerful draw spells like Windfall, you could rip through your entire deck incredibly quickly. Being an artifact made Memory Jar broken in a ton of other ways too. For example, you could use cards Goblin Welder to cheat the card out of the graveyard. It was also able to be tutored out with cards like Tinker, and could be cast off of a busted lands like Mishra's Workshop that makes a ridiculous 3 mana, but only for artifact spells. Basically, Memory Jar had a ridiculously powerful effect, and happened to be the perfect card type for it to have tons of extra synergies to make it even more busted than other similar cards. Considering the power of Memory Jar and the environment the card was printed in, it's no wonder that Wizards banned the card so quickly. Could Memory Jar be unbanned? This is a no. The card is actually pretty close to being fine to unban. 5 mana for a wheel is pretty bad for most decks that would want the effect. But normally combo decks would probably just play Ad Nauseam instead, as it often actually drew them more cards. The card that makes it so that this card can't come off the list is the previously mentioned Goblin Welder. This 1 mana goblin being able to tap itself to switch a jar in your graveyard with any random artifact on the battlefield would be by far the best thing to do with jar in the format. Welder sees play in Mono Red Painter, a deck that tries to assemble Painter's Servant and Grindstone to mill your opponent in one fell swoop. Welder is already great in the deck, and the deck would love to have a hand to refill to be able to dig for more parts of the combos or more mana ramp cards like Mox Opal to be able to pull off their combo. Jar's ability to draw so many cards when combined with Welder's specifically is really the only scenario where the card is too good. Could Memory Jar be fixed to be unbanned? There's not much you can do, since Welder's ability to nab the card makes it far too easy to abuse. The best answer is adding an ability that would make you exile the card instead of put it into the battlefield if it would enter the battlefield without being cast. But this kind of ham-fisted approach to stopping combos is pretty uncommon. Alternatively, you could reduce the number of cards it draws you. Reducing it to 4 cards would be a big nerf, but it would be very easy to unban it at that point. We have Flash. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has the effect where you put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Then you sacrifice it unless you pay its mana cost minus 2 generic mana. This card was banned in June of 2007. Now, why was Flash banned? This card was part of the infamous turn 0 win with Protean Hulk. This means that you could win the game going second on your opponent's first turn, usually before they even played a land by stopping them during their upkeep. Hulk is a pretty broken card in its own right. This 7 mana 6/6 with the ability where, when it dies, you search your library for any number of creature cards with a total mana value of 6 or less, and put them directly into the battlefield. This is a ridiculously strong effect that will literally win you the game on the spot. The best piles for Flash Hulk decks have changed over time, but they all just won you the game on the spot. For a quick example, you could do something like find a Karen Feeder and a Karmic Guide. Guide reanimates a creature from your graveyard when it enters the battlefield. This lets you get your Hulk right back, then you can sacrifice it to Karen's ability to use it again. Then you just find Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker. This is a creature with haste, letting you activate its ability as soon as it enters the battlefield, and has the ability where you can tap it to create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. That token has haste, but you lose at the beginning of the next end step. So, what you do is activate its ability targeting the guide, and then sacrifice the guide to Feeder. You make the copy using its ability to reanimate the original guide. Then you sacrifice your Kiki Jiki to Feeder, and use guide to reanimate Kiki Jiki to get it back untapped. You just repeat this loop until you had as many creatures as you want. Eventually, you stop the loop to grab your Hulk again to tutor out some cards like Blood Artist to turn all those extra tokens that you're about to lose anyway into damage. This is only one Hulk pile, of course. Flash is just the best card to allow you to get your Hulk out and kill it all at once. Now, this is a 2 mana spell. So how exactly is this a turn 0 kill? Well, the turn 0 kill is actually a bit difficult to get to work, since you kind of have to draw a perfect hand. You basically need to open Gemstone Caverns, a land that allows you to start the game with it on the battlefield if you're going second, by exiling another card from your hand. And if you do, you can tap it for any color of mana. Then you can use a card like Elvish or Simian Spear Guide to add 1 extra mana to cast your Flash. You could also use 2 guides and Metamorphose to get the blue mana you need, but this was kind of going too deep on the strategy. You would mostly play Caverns and the guides, and usually try to win on turn 1 most of the time, and just be happy if you happen to open the turn 0 kill. Due to just how powerful this combo was, Wizards banned the card. Now, could Flash be unbanned? This is a big no, but not necessarily because the card would be too good outright. Legacy has even more cards that can counter this strategy than there were when the card was banned. Cards like Leyline of the Void and Force of Will can help a lot, but new cards like Endurance can help decks interrupt the combo for 0 mana, allowing them to interact with the turn 0 kill. However, the issue comes from the fact that a lot of decks can't afford to play these cards, especially in the main board. There are quite a few viable strategies in Legacy that rely on playing early interaction to stop your opponent if you're trying to combo off. However, in order for them to do that, you have to have mana. Being able to stop your opponent during their upkeep and try to kill them is just way too much for most decks to deal with. It basically means that you can get combo killed out of the game going first or second, meaning the only way to not die is play 0 mana interaction. Considering how Flash kills a lot of decks' diversity in the format, keeping it banned is better for the format as a whole. Even if the best decks in the format currently like Delver wouldn't have the biggest issue dealing with it. So, how could Flash be fixed to be unbanned? Really, the issue here is Protean Hulk. Flash is just the best way to enable it. Without Hulk in the format, Flash would be fine and honestly a pretty interesting card that you could have some very interesting and healthy decks built around. So you could just ban Hulk, or you could just change Hulk to be less broken. Hulk should probably exile itself if it uses its ability, as being able to recycle the card off its own effect is extremely broken. Additionally, it should probably be made a little worse overall as well. It should be restricted in how many cards it can search out, so that you can't do things like search any number of 0-mana creatures for other combos. With both of those changes, it might be okay, but I'd have to look at all the possible combos first. Honestly, Hulk should probably just get hit. Next up, we have Frantic Search. This is an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has the effect where you draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards, and then untap up to 3 lands. This card was banned in September of 1999. Now, why was Frantic Search banned? Well, the ability to draw 2 and then discard 2 cards for basically no cost is extremely good for combo decks that need to find specific cards. Sure, it does make you go -1, but if you only need to find a few specific cards to win the game, that doesn't really matter. And since the card doesn't actually use any mana up, you can still play out your combo in the same turn if you do happen to draw into them. You can also make this card even better by combining it with any number of other cards. The easiest way to make this card better is by using it with cards that like to have cards in your graveyard. If you discard a card with flashback, you're not losing as much card advantage, making the card a lot better. However, this is a bit slow for combo decks in Legacy. Instead, people have more often combined the card things like High Tide to make extra mana. Tide makes it so that each time you tap an island for the rest of the turn, you add an additional blue mana. So with a card like Search, you can tap 3 lands for 6 blue mana, cast Search to draw some cards, and untap those lands and tap them again for 6 more mana, giving you a crazy 9 blue mana. With all this mana, you can cast a ton of draw spells, then cast more copies of Search or similar cards like Cloud of Fairies to make even more mana. Once you do that, it's pretty easy to put together a combo to win. Due to just how broken these combos were, Search was banned to rein in these High Tide combo decks. Now, could Frantic Search be unbanned? This is a soft yes. The issue is that the best uses for this card require you to have lands in play, which is a pretty slow win condition for Legacy nowadays. Having to wait until turn 3 to start your combo is pretty terrible in a format where most combo decks can kill you on turn 1 or 2. Combo decks are simply too focused on winning the game as early as possible to be interested in waiting until turn 3 for Search to really be effective. Next up, we have Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. These are 2 draw spells that share the Delve keyword in common. Cruise is a sorcery that costs 7 and 1 blue and lets you draw 3 cards, while Dig is an instant that costs 6 and 2 blue and has the effect where you look at the top 7 cards of your library and put 2 of them into your hand, then you put the rest at the bottom of your library in any order. Delve makes both of these spells far easier to cast, letting you exile any number of cards from your graveyard to help cast them, each one paying for 1 generic mana. Treasure Cruise was banned in January of 2015, while Dig lasted until September of the same year. Why are these cards banned? The issue is that they're just far too good at drawing you cards. Filling your graveyard with cards is extremely easy to format like Legacy, where decks are built to run so low to the ground. Most decks play tons of 1-mana spells like Brainstorm, or even 0-mana spells like Lotus Petal and Mishra's Bauble, or the previously mentioned free interaction in the form of Force of Will and Endurance. And of course, most decks are playing plenty of fetch lands. All of this is to say that it only takes a few turns to fill your graveyard with 5 to 7 cards. This is why just about every powerful Delve spell has been extremely good at some point in the format. Not only are powerful cards like Murktide Regent currently putting in lots of works, but cards like Hooting Mandrills and Gurmag Angler were great despite just being basically big creatures with Delve without any other real upsides. Now, these big, fat threats are amazing, and getting to draw cards is great, so it might seem like the power of these cards is pretty in line. The thing is, this kind of card advantage is a lot harder to get a hold of for this little mana. There are quite a few cheap threats like Delver of Secrets, Death's Shadow, and Tarmogoyf. Sure, these all have their own downsides, but so do the Delve threats. It's much rarer to just be able to draw 3 cards in the format. Expressive Iteration has pushed Delver to the forefront of the format due to being a 2-mana draw 2 with a downside. Both Cruise and Dig are similarly strong cards that are ultimately a bit easier to work with than Iteration. This powerful draw would be pretty crazy for any blue deck, no matter what they're trying to do. Aggro, mid-range, control, and combo decks would all be playing some number of these cards. Since this draw power would make blue decks way too strong, Blizzards went ahead and hit the card. Could Dig Through Time and or Treasure Cruise be unbanned? Dig Through Time could be unbanned, but Cruise could not. The main difference is the fact that Dig has 2 blue mana symbols in its cost. Having to pay 2 actual blue mana for your spells makes it a lot slower. It means you can't do anywhere near as much that turn. Due to this, some decks may choose to continue playing Iteration over Dig where it's unbanned, specifically if they're already trying to delve a ton of cards to something like Murktide. Cruise, on the other hand, is a lot more of an issue, as tons of combo decks that aren't already playing delve spells would be made better if they could refill halfway through the combo, and other control or mid-range decks that could make room for it would have way too strong of a late game with a 1-mana draw 3. Next up, we have Gush. This is an instant with a mana cost of 4 and 1 blue. It has the effect where you draw 2 cards, and it can be cast for free by bouncing 2 islands you control to the owner's hand. This card was banned in June of 2003. So why is Gush banned? The real question is where to start. Gush is a card that may look unassuming at first, but just gets better and better the more you think about it. It's a card with a very simple effect, but a ton of different ways to use it. First off, a 0 mana draw spell is obviously really good. Having to wait until at least turn 2 to cast it is a bit of a bummer. However, the decks that want it are more than fine waiting that long. Rather than being played in all-in combo decks that want to win on turn 1, it's these plain tempo, mid-range, control decks, or slower combo decks that are fine with waiting a few turns and just plain interaction to stay alive. Now, you may think that going down 2 lands is a huge cost and something you'd never want to do. This is usually true, but if you simply build around Gush, it's not really an issue. It's pretty easy to only build your deck with cheap spells that only cost 3 mana at the absolute most, and free spells in Legacy, especially in blue where you can play all of the great 0 mana counter spells. However, bouncing lands to your hand can actually be a huge upside in a ton of situations. For example, if your opponent tries to wasteland one of your lands, you can use a Gush to save it. Or if you can Gush 2 lands to your hand before casting a Brainstorm, put the 2 lands back into your deck and then shuffle them away, basically drawing 5 spells for 1 blue mana. Of course, you'd need to make sure you didn't accidentally take yourself out of the game by doing this, but getting that much card draw is a huge boon. You can also use Gush to actually put you up on mana. If you only have 2 lands on turn 3, you can tap your lands for mana and Gush them back to your hand and then play one of them again, getting you a total of 3 mana. This is, of course, only the very tip of the iceberg. There are so many ways to make Gush just a little bit better, and getting that much mileage off of a card that is, I'd like to remind you, a 0 mana draw 2 is way too strong. This card would basically make blue so much better than every other color that you'd basically have to play it to win it all. So, could Gush be unbanned? No, not at all. The card is still way too good, and it would be great in Delver, the best deck of the format. The card needs to stay banned. Finally, we have Hermit Druid. This is a 1/1 creature with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has the ability where you can pay 1 green and tap it to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a basic land card. You put that card into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. This card was banned and extended in December of 2003 and remained on the Legacy ban list as the format split. Now, why was Hermit Druid banned? This card doesn't seem to have a very powerful ability, only really drawing you a basic land and milling a few cards. However, what if I told you could just simply not play any basics in your deck? Well, that would cause the Druid to rip through your entire library with reckless abandon, throwing each and every card directly into your graveyard. Then you could do the old oops all spell strategy. You reanimate your Necroamoeba, use them to flashback a Dread Return, and Thoracle remains a mistake of a magic card. This basically makes Hermit Druid a 1-card combo that instantly wins you the game. Now, the exact combos were very different all the way back in 2003, but Druid has been able to win you the game off of a single activation for most of its lifetime. This was simply way too good for Magic all the way back in 2003, so the card was banned to stop it from running amok. Could Hermit Druid be unbanned? This is a soft yes. There are a few good analogies for this deck currently legal in Legacy, though this version of the deck would have some notable upsides and downsides. Cephalid Breakfast is built around the card Cephalid Illusionist, a 2-mana 1/1 that mills you for 3 whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability. By combining this with a card like Nomad's Encore, which could target with an ability for 0 mana as many times as you wanted, you could simply mill your entire deck. This lets you pull off all of the same combos as with Hermit Druid. The big difference is that you need 2 cards in the battlefield to pull off the combo. Druid has the amazing upside of only needing you to draw it to win the game. However, it does have another big downside, namely the fact that you have to cast Hermit Druid, wait a turn, and then activate it thanks to Summoning Sickness. This gives your opponent an entire turn to answer Druid before you can do your combo. It also means that, without some sort of mana acceleration, the fastest you can put the combo together is an entire turn slower than the Cephalid Breakfast combo. So the deck would maybe be a better version of Cephalid Breakfast, or it could even be a solid addition to the deck by making it even easier for the deck to find its combo. However, this is the kind of thing that just about every deck in Legacy is ready to deal with, either by comboing faster, playing interaction, or just plain lock pieces that stop them from doing anything anyway. This might be a little bit too good, but Doomsday is a pretty busted combo deck and it's fine in Legacy. So Hermit Druid is probably fine to unban. We have Mind Twist. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of X, meaning any amount of mana and 1 black mana. It has the effect where target player discards X cards at random. Mind Twist was banned during the inception of Extended in July of 1997 and has been on the ban list for Legacy ever since. So, why was Mind Twist banned? Similar to Balance, Mind Twist could easily lead to complete non-games. Thanks to cards like Dark Ritual and other fast mana, you could cast Mind Twist for X equals as much as 7 on the first turn of the game. This would allow you to rip all the cards out of your opponent's hand before they even had a chance to play the game, forcing your opponent to pray for lands off the top, and then for spells they can cast at that point with no cards at all in hand, leaves them in a losing position. Sure, you could have used a lot of cards as well, but the rate here is still worth it. If you have 3 Dark Rituals, a land, and Mind Twist, you can make 7 black mana and rip 6 of the 7 cards out of your opponent's hand, having only used 4 cards of your own. This leaves you not only with way more cards in hand, but your opponent will only be able to keep 1 random card, meaning that they'll be very unlikely to even be able to play. Thanks to how easy the card can lead to these game states, Mind Twist was banned. So, could Mind Twist be unbanned? This is a soft yes. The only thing stopping it from easily coming back is the fact that Wizards doesn't like to unban cards if they'll lead to bad, unfun gimmick decks like Mind Twist would. The card simply isn't that broken anymore. When talking about the strength of Mind Twist, we should go over Hymn to Turok. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 black with the effect where target player discards 2 cards at random. Hymn is a very powerful card, but it's not so strong that it's breaking the format or even anywhere close in modern day Legacy play. When comparing these 2 cards, Hymn comes out on top in basically every scenario except when you happen to draw a ton of fast mana on turn 1 alongside Twist. To get the same amount of value off of Twist as you get off of Hymn, you need to spend 3 mana. This 1 mana difference is huge as it means you'll have to cast the spell a whole turn later. The thing about discard spells is that they're better the earlier you cast them. In the later turns of a game, your opponent is far more likely to not have any cards in hand, or have a value engine on the battlefield, or have a counterspell in hand, or any number of other things that make discarding from their hand less good. Ripping cards early does a lot more as it stops their important turn 1 and 2 plays. X spells are balanced around scaling into the late game, but discard spells get worse and worse the later a game goes. This is why the best discard spells are 1 or 2 mana spells like Thoughtseize or Hymn. So the only real use for this card is as a payoff for a combo deck where you try to draw a ton of fast mana with the card on turn 1. But there's really no reason to use Twist over any other combo ender. In fact, giving your opponent a chance to come back at all is pretty silly in a format where decks like Doomsday and Storm can easily just kill you whenever you want. Ultimately, the card basically just doesn't do much in the modern day. So from a parallel perspective, unbanning the card is perfectly fine. However, it won't really add anything to the format, and considering how unfun getting Twisted for 7 is, Wizards will probably be content to let the card rot in the ban list, even if it could come off. Next up, we have Mana Vault. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1. It has the abilities where it doesn't untap during your untap step, and you can tap it to add 3 colorless mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may pay 4 to untap Mana Vault, and at the beginning of your draw step, Vault deals 1 damage to you if it's tapped. Mana Vault was banned in September of 1999. Now, why was Mana Vault banned? Well, when you think about it, Vault is basically just a better Dark Ritual. It gives you 3 mana for 1 mana. However, Vault lets you save the mana from one turn to the next. So you can do things like cast it on turn 1 and then wait until the next turn to cast a 5-drop. It can also be untapped to add more mana, letting it combo with cards like Manifold Key to produce absurd amounts of mana. And possibly, most important of all, it asks for no colored mana to cast. The only downsides are dealing a pitifully low amount of damage to you if you leave it tapped and making colorless mana instead of black mana. These downsides aren't nearly enough to slow the card down. Dark Ritual is already pretty absurd, and giving decks another 4 copies of the card would allow combo decks to get a lot more consistent than they already are. Vault has only gotten better as time has gone on. The always annoyingly strong Urza Saga can 2-drop both Vault and Manifold Key with its final chapter, giving you access to a ton of combo lines in the late game and artifact decks. However, the thing that makes Vault such an issue is being colorless. Vault can be run in any deck that wants a lot of mana, and in fact, since Key is also colorless, you can just shove them to anything with a minimal downside. Dark Ritual forcing you to run black producing lands does a lot to restrict the card, as you can't run it with things like Cloud Post or Ancient Tomb strategies nearly as easily. The ease with which Mana Vault can be run in decks, alongside the additional redundancy it provides combo decks, is simply too much. Could Mana Vault be unbanned? This is a no. Giving every deck access to this kind of fast mana would simply be too much and allow for way too many turn 1 wins. Even using Mana Vault to slam Trinisphere into play on turn 1 would usually be enough to win. These kinds of plays the main game plan of stompy decks in the format who rely on soul lands like Ancient Tomb and City of Traders to play these cards earlier. Due to running these colorless mana sources, these decks couldn't run Dark Ritual before, but Vault could slot into the deck without much issue. This is just an example of why the lack of colorless restrictions of the card is so problematic. How could Mana Vault be fixed to be unbanned? This is a bit difficult, since simply cutting it down to only tapping for 2 mana may not be enough. Forcing players to pay some colored mana would at least restrict the card as well as make it unsearchable by Urza Saga, but this would be a strange move to say the least. Really, this kind of fast mana is really problematic, especially when there are several cards with the effect. There's a real issue with redundancy, and having too many cards like this available will always be an issue. Speaking of cards that make lots of colorless mana, next up we have Mishra's Workshop. This is a land that you can tap to add 3 colorless mana, but the mana can only be spent on artifact spells. Workshop was banned in September of 2004. Now, why was Mishra's Workshop banned? Artifacts are an incredibly powerful card type, with tons of powerful cards and synergies. 3 mana for any card type would be completely insane. However, artifacts have the additional upside of, generally speaking, not requiring any colored mana. This means a single workshop could cast a wide variety of powerful cards. The previously mentioned Trinity Sphere could be cast off of a single workshop. A turn 1 Trinity Sphere can stop your opponent from casting any spells at all for 2 whole turns, while Workshop allows you to slam more and more cards into play. Other powerful cards like Lodestone Golem, Mystic Forge, and Nettlecyst can be played on the first 2 turns of the game. This is only scratching the surface of cards you can cast off a Workshop on turn 1 or 2 and would put you insanely far ahead. For reference, Workshop is completely unrestricted in Vintage, the most powerful format in Magic, and has been a centerpiece of a deck playing all these cards for years. If the card were unbanned at Legacy, the deck could be ported over with basically no changes and would be far, far too strong for that format. This was largely true all the way back in 2004, so the card was banned to stop these powerful artifact-based decks from ruining the format. Could Mishra's Workshop be unbanned? No, not even close. Not only are artifact decks already extremely good in Legacy, decks are already using the Soul Lands to slam the same kinds of lock pieces into play. Workshop would be enough to enable these decks all on its own. So knowing that decks with this strategy are already doing well in the format only cements that the card is simply too good. How could Mishra's Workshop be fixed to be unbanned? This one is difficult. In a vacuum, having it tap for only 2 mana and having the same restriction would theoretically be enough for a format as powerful as Legacy. However, we once again run into the issue of redundancy. Currently, there are already 2 lands that tap for 2 mana the turn you play them in Legacy: Ancient Tomb and City of Traders. Decks having access to 12 copies of these lands would make them far, far too consistent and powerful. With that being the case, there's no real way to fix the card without either completely changing its effect or simply banning other cards. Next up, we have Mind's Desire. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 4 and 2 blue. It has the effect where you shuffle your library, then exile the top card of your library. Until the end of the turn, you can cast that spell without paying its mana cost. It also has Storm, meaning when you cast the spell, you copy it for each other spell cast before this turn. Mind's Desire was banned in June of 2003. Now, why was Mind's Desire banned? To put it simply, if you're able to cast Mind's Desire, you're usually going to win the game. Getting a fairly high storm count simply isn't very hard in decks that want to do so. Not only do you have a lot of cards we've already talked about like Rituals, but cards like Lion's Eye Diamond and Lotus Petal can also help you beef up your storm count and get the mana you need for a spell like Desire. Combine that with other copies of Mind's Desire and powerful draw spells, and things get out of hand fast. What tends to happen is the player will cast Desire with the storm count of something like 4 or 5. This would give them access to a random number of draw spells and rituals to add even more mana and draw more cards. This would let you continue to combo off, adding to your storm count further, and then either cast another Desire to spin into even more combo pieces, or cast a different storm card like Tendrils of Agony to just win the game. Mind's Desire doesn't directly win you the game, but the amount of card advantage it gives you in a storm deck will allow you to find the win some other way. This basically lowered the bar for storm decks to win the game so much that they really couldn't be stopped. Could Mind's Desire be unbanned? This is another soft yes. The game has been power crept a lot since 2003. Since then, Galvanic Relay has been printed. This is a sorcerer that costs 2 and 1 red, it has Storm, and lets you exile the top card of your library, and then play that card on your next turn. Relay does force you to wait a turn, and still requires you to pay the cost of the card. But these are pretty reasonable trade-offs for costing half the mana that Desires does. For more evidence of Desire's slip away from relevance, we can look at Vintage, where the card has been restricted to 1 copy for years. The card does still see play there, but it hasn't topped a major event for a few years now. Now, Vintage and Legacy are different formats that play very differently, and we can go over the differences for quite a while if we want it. However, this does demonstrate yet again that the card isn't quite as broken as it used to be. Decks simply have better combos, better interaction, and better threats to threaten these decks and force them to combo suboptimally more often. Storm decks in Legacy haven't been problematic for years, and Desire likely wouldn't make them so strong as to break them. This is another card where you could technically get away with unbanning it without breaking anything, but it seems unlikely that Wizards would ever do it. They did give Storm decks a retrain in the form of Relay rather recently, so it seems like Wizards isn't interested in bringing the card back without some major changes. This seems to be another card that Wizards would rather print replacements for rather than bring back in full force. And finally, we have Arkham's Astrolabe. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1 snow mana, which is any mana produced by a snow permanent. It has the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You can also pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. This card was banned in February of 2021. Now, why was Arkham's Astrolabe banned? The simple answer is that the card makes it too difficult to interact with your opponent's lands. We've gone over this card in the context of Modern already in the series, and everything that was said there is largely true here. Wizards doesn't like 4 or 5 color decks being too easy to build. And Astrolabe allows you to play as many colors as you want without being punished. Even with powerful mana-based interactions like Wasteland in the format, since Astrolabe allows any land to make any color of mana, it becomes basically impossible to stop your opponent from making the right colors of mana if they have an Astrolabe. You need a card like Stony Silence in play in addition to a card like Blood Moon to slow them down, and this just isn't practical. So the question then becomes, why are 4 and 5 color decks being too popular such an issue? The answer is how it homogenizes deck building. If you can play all 5 colors, you can just play all the best cards rather than choosing a few colors to play based on what cards you want access to for your deck. This means that different fair strategies basically don't have a reason to exist. Why play a dedicated humans deck when you don't need cards like Cavern of Souls to fix your mana? It makes far more sense to just play the generically strongest cards available rather than leaning on specific synergies. Due to the inherent lack of diversity in a format where 4 and 5 color decks are the norm, Wizards make sure to make mana denial strong enough to force players to play only 2 to 3 colors generically, and as a result they ban cards like Astrolabe. Could Astrolabe be unbanned? No. All the issues it creates still exist. Currently, playing 1 mana to cycle and fix your mana forever is still too good, and as more and more cards get printed, having access to all 5 colors of mana will likely only get more and more broken. How could Astrolabe be fixed to be unbanned? This is pretty hard to do. Making it cost more mana would just make it a Prophetic Prism, a card that's never really been playable. Making it so that it doesn't draw you cards might be enough, but it would still lead to a lot of the same issues. The only other change I can think of that would restrict the card enough would be making you pay 2 mana and tap it to add a mana of any color. But that would also make the card unplayable. Cutting off the card draw is the only real avenue of weakening the card that would retrain its function. We have Tolarian Academy. This is a legendary land with the ability where you can tap to add 1 blue mana for each artifact you control. Academy was banned in December of 1998. So why was Tolarian Academy banned? This card is incredible at generating tons of mana in artifact-focused decks. There are already decks in Legacy built around throwing tons of artifacts out as fast as possible. For example, 8cast is a deck built around playing as many artifacts as quickly as possible to synergize with the powerful affinity for artifact decks. This is an ability that makes a spell cost 1 less for each artifact you control. So with a spell like Frogmite, if you have 4 or more artifacts, you can cast the spell for free. There are tons of 0-mana artifacts like Mox Opal and Mishra's Bauble that you can use to flood your board with artifacts. Tolarian Academy would cause 2 major issues. First off, it would make these affinity decks way better, as now they'd be able to add ludicrous amounts of mana each turn. And considering the deck's namesake cards are both draw 2s, meaning you could easily churn through your deck and flood your board with more and more cards. However, you don't actually need to play any affinity cards for this to work. You could easily run a less artifact-reliant strategy with plenty of artifacts and use Academy to generate loads of mana for various different effects. By using cards like Twiddle, you can repeatedly tap and untap your Academy for mana and use the mana to cast powerful draw spells to refill your hand. All you need for this to work is to play a few number of cheap artifacts to flood the board with beforehand to turn your Academy on, and there are plenty of cards that fill that role, as we've already discussed. So, due to how many different ways there are to break this card with artifacts, the card simply had to be banned. Could Tolarian Academy be unbanned? This is another hard no. The card would break 8cast in half, and that's just shoving it in a deck that already exists without building around it at all. People would find various all-in combo decks, artifact-based aggro decks, and mid-range decks that can make use of this card, and it would be incredible. It would be far too easy to break the card, even with all the non-basic land hate in the format. A good bar to judge this by is the card Gias's Cradle. This card is from the same cycle as Academy, tapping for green equal to the number of creatures you control. Gias's Cradle has been the backbone of Elves decks in the format for years now, and is still doing a ton of work to this day. The thing is, Academy is a lot easier to use than Cradle is. Artifacts, as a rule, don't require colored mana, which means there are both a lot more 0-mana artifacts and a lot more good 0-mana artifacts. This allows you to just vomit your hand into the field turn 1 before making a ton of mana and just going off. Whereas Cradle decks have to usually wait until turn 2 or 3 for their combo turns. Thanks to just how powerful this ability is, the card has to stay banned. How could Tolarian Academy be fixed to be unbanned? This is pretty hard to do without completely changing the card or making it basically impossible to actually use the ability. Storm the Vault is a 4 enchantment that transforms into an Academy if you control 5 or more artifacts during the end step. Forcing you to get 4 mana for the card and then find 5 artifacts is more than enough to stop it from being too good. And that's mostly because you'll never actually get to transform it into Academy. There's basically no fix I can think of that retrains the card's functions without being broken. Next up, we have Windfall. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has the effect where each player discards their hand, then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards discarded this way. Windfall was banned in December of 1998. Why was Windfall banned? At the end of the day, Windfall is very close to cards like Wheel of Fortune. While it won't often draw you the full 7 cards in the late game, Windfall is still usually a very powerful draw spell nonetheless. As long as you have less cards in your hand than your opponent, you'll be benefiting from the card. To ensure that happens, you can cast the card on turn 1 with the various pieces of fast mana available in the format. Even better, the card functions great later into combo turns after you've cast another wheel like Echo of Eons to fill your opponent's hand with the full 7 cards. We've already talked about Wheel of Fortune in the series and why it needs to stay banned, and the long and short of Windfall is that it's just too close in power level to these cards to stay in the format. Could Windfall be unbanned? This is very close, but it's a no. Windfall is worse enough than the other 3 mana wheels that, in a vacuum, the card would be fine. However, there are a few interactions and other cards in the game that make Windfall just a little bit too good. In particular, Echo of Eons. This particular wheel costs 6 to cast from your hand, but can be flashed back for only 3 mana, and has the effect of shuffling all cards in players' hands and graveyards into the libraries, and then each player draws 7 cards. Because Echo is best in your graveyard, Windfall and Echo play excellently together. Windfall can discard all your Echoes to the graveyard, and Echo keeps your opponent at 7 cards so that Windfall gets the most value it can. As strong as these cards are together, the big issue is just decks having access to both of them. Echo is already seen playing a few combo decks, and giving those decks access to copies 5 through 8 of the card would make these decks far too consistent. The issue isn't that Echo or Windfall are simply too strong, the issue is really just having more than 4 copies of this effect in a deck is simply too good for combo decks. How could Windfall be fixed to be unbanned? Really, it doesn't need any nerfs. Again, the only issue with unbanning the card is redundancy. Next up, we have Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. This is a 2/1 legendary monkey pirate with a mana cost of 1 red. It has the ability where, when it deals combat damage to a player, you exile the top card of that player's library. Until end of turn, you may cast that card, and you also create a treasure token. This is an artifact with an ability where you can tap it and sacrifice and add 1 mana of any color. It also has dash for 1 and 1 red. This is an alternative casting cost where you can cast Ragavan for its mana cost rather than just 1 red. When you do, it gains haste, but it bounces back to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. This card was banned in January 2022. Now, why was Ragavan banned? The simple answer is that the card gave you way too much value for a 1-drop. Generally speaking, the 2 most powerful effects of Magic are drawing extra cards and getting extra mana. If you look at the most broken strategies throughout the game's histories, the most broken strategies are almost always ones that generate lots of mana or draw too many cards. Ragavan gives you an extra draw and an extra mana every time it hits your opponent. This isn't completely outlandish, as there are tons of cards that give you this kind of bonus. The issue is that Ragavan does both for far too cheap. Getting hit with Ragavan even once puts you really far behind. Even if your opponent is only getting a card from your deck rather than their own, most decks rely on enough generic staples that they'll have a good chance of hitting something that they can play. The extra mana also allows them to get very far ahead on tempo, able to play while keeping mana up for interactions or playing a more expensive spell earlier. On top of all this, dash allows you to sneak Ragavan in on turns where your opponent doesn't have blockers and dodge sorcery speed removal. All this together made Ragavan a must-kill threat. With how many narrow games can be in the format, a single Ragavan trigger was often enough to tip the scales in your favor. The best move when your opponent played a turn 1 Ragavan was basically always to play a removal spell to kill it, and if the Ragavan player had cards like Days of Protected, you were often simply out of luck. Due to how good Ragavan was in decks like Delver, Wizards had to ban the card. Could Ragavan be unbanned? Absolutely not. This card is simply far too good at running away with games. Delver decks are, even after the recent bannings, still extremely strong, and there's no reason to give them another very powerful spell back. How could Ragavan be fixed to be unbanned? The combat damage trigger needs to be substantially weaker. It simply gives you far too much value as it currently exists. Removing one of the 2 halves might do it, but if it still draws you a card, it might be too good. The most reasonable fix in my eyes is removing both the ability to make treasures and the dash ability. This would open enough counterplay and lessen the blow when the card works enough that it could probably come back. Next up, we have Wrenn and 6. This is a Planeswalker for 3 loyalty and a mana cost of 1 red and 1 green. It has a +1 where you return up to 1 target land card from your graveyard to your hand, and you can -1 it to deal 1 damage to any target, and you can -7 it to get an emblem with each instant and sorcery card in the graveyard has Retrace. Retrace is a keyword that allows you to recast a card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to its other costs. This card was banned in November of 2019. Now, why was Wrenn and 6 banned? While its abilities may seem a bit weak, they do so much in so many situations that you wouldn't think of at first glance. The first thing that needs to be said is the -1 ability makes 1 toughness creatures virtually unplayable, especially ones that cost more than 1 mana. Being able to -1 your 2 mana Planeswalker to kill any 1 toughness creature on the board is a great deal. It makes playing those 1 mana creatures at all a waste of mana, considering that cards like Mother of Runes and Thalia, Garden of Thraben have seen a ton of play in the format. You can see how disruptive this card can be to the metagame. The +1 is the more universally powerful ability, however. One major upside of the +1 is how it helps fix your mana. If you have a fetch land, you can repeatedly get the fetch land back every turn, allowing you to search the best land in your deck for each turn, as long as it's the right land type. One of the most problematic lands with Wrenn, however, is Wasteland. This is a land that you can tap for colorless or tap and sacrifice to destroy target non-basic land. Wasteland is one of the most important cards in Legacy, and Wrenn and 6 is both amazing with and against Wasteland. If your opponent tries to wasteland any of your lands, you can just get that land back next turn and play it again. Sure, you did go down a land, but so did your opponent. Eventually, you'll be able to keep playing your lands and get the mana you need. However, the really scary part of the card is using your own wasteland and then picking it back up with Wrenn and 6. This could let you wasteland your opponent every single turn, stopping them from ever getting access to more mana. And if they ever whiff on top decking a land, you get to start removing all of their lands, unless they happen to be playing a few basics. None of these factors on their own are too good, but all of them together made Wrenn and 6 far too format warping to stay around. Could Wrenn and 6 be unbanned? No. The card would still bend the format around it too much. There are still tons of 1 toughness creatures that would be far too good against, and more broken lands have been printed since the card's banning. How can Wrenn and 6 be fixed to be unbanned? Changing the +1 to put the land on top of your library instead of into your hand is the only fix I can think of, besides just making it cost more mana. That would at least slow the card down enough for decks to try and leverage some advantage against them. Next up, we have Sensei's Divining Top. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1. It has the ability where you can pay 1 mana to look at the top 3 cards of your library, and then put them back in any order you want. You can also tap the card to draw a card, and then put Divining Top on top of your library. This card was banned in April of 2017. Now, why was Top banned? Top was extremely powerful when combined with other mechanics that care about the top card of your library. There were 2 main ways this was used in Legacy. First was the Miracle mechanic. This is a mechanic where, when you draw a card, if that card has Miracle and is the first card you drew this turn, you can cast it for its Miracle cost. You can even do this if the card is drawn at the time you normally wouldn't cast it, such as your opponent's turn. Top worked great with this mechanic, both letting you stack your deck with Miracle cards and draw them at instant speed to cast them during your opponent's turn. The other way the card was used was with Counterbalance. This is an enchantment with the cost of 2 blue, where it has the ability where, whenever your opponent casts a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If the spell they cast and the card at the top of your library is the same mana value, you counter that spell. Top allows you to check the top 3 cards of your library for a card with the same mana value as whatever spell your opponent casts to counter it with Counterbalance. This made it very difficult to play the game at all, as a huge number of your spells would get countered for 1 or even 0 mana, and without your opponent giving up any cards. The combination of these 2 synergies created a deck called Miracles, a control deck that used the top alongside these powerful cards to lock your opponent out of the game. Not only was this deck incredibly strong, it also took an incredibly long time to pilot. Players would constantly have to pause the game to check the top cards of their library and try and consider the best order for them to be stacked in. While doing this every once in a while isn't an issue, it added up really quickly. This led to the deck holding up major tournaments as round after round would go into time. Since the deck would continue to be powerful for years to come and it was causing so many issues, Wizards banned Top. Could Sensei's Divining Top be unbanned? This is another no. The card would still enable the style of deck, and besides the power level concerns, the deck would still cause major issues at tournaments. How could Sensei's Divining Top be fixed to be unbanned? The best fix would probably be giving both of its abilities a can only be activated as a sorcery clause. This would fix both the Miracles and Counterbalance issue. The only place the card could be an issue then was if it was combined with Belasted Citadel, but this combo is probably fine in a format like Legacy. Next up, we have Skull Clamp. This is an artifact equipment with a mana cost of 1. It has the ability where the equipped creature gets +1/-1. When equipped creature dies, you draw 2 cards. It also has an equipped cost of 1. This card was banned in September of 2004. Why was Skull Clamp banned? The main issue is that it both gives you a way to kill your creatures and a huge payoff for killing those creatures. Drawing 2 cards is a very powerful effect, and getting this effect for a 1 mana and a 1 toughness creature is extremely powerful. Not to mention that cards like Young Pyromancer allows you to make a surplus of 1/1 tokens to sacrifice. In the case of Pyromancer, since you get a token each time you cast an instant or sorcery, this would let you easily chain spells into drawing more cards, into more spells, and so on. This is only the very tip of the iceberg in terms of what the card can do. There are simply far too many ways you can abuse Skull Clamp to draw far too many cards. Now, while you couldn't usually use this card's advantage as part of a combo, since you just wouldn't have room in your deck alongside your Skull Clamp engine, however, combining this level of card draw with tons of cheap interaction and strong threats makes it basically impossible to beat these decks in a fair game. Because of this insane draw power, Skull Clamp had to be banned. Could Skull Clamp be unbanned? This is a no. It's actually a lot closer than people would probably think. But there are a few cards printed more recently that make the card incredibly problematic. The main issue is that it's yet another card that's searchable off of Urza's Saga. Even if the card is somewhat niche, making Saga decks even better is something that shouldn't be happening right now. If Saga got hit, it could maybe come off the list, but outside of that, the card needs to remain banned. How could Skull Clamp be fixed to be unbanned? Hilariously, all the card needs to be fine is for the stat boost it gives to be a +1/+0 instead of a +1/-1. Finally, to wrap up the series, we have 2 of the most recently banned cards in Legacy. In March of 2023, White Plume Adventurer and Expressive Iteration were both banned. Both of these cards are still too good to be unbanned, so we'll talk about why they were banned. Starting with Expressive Iteration. This is a source with a mana cost of 1 blue and 1 red. It is the effect where you look at the top 3 cards of your library. You put one of them into your hand, one at the bottom of your library, and exile the last one. For the rest of the turn, you can play that card. Why was Expressive Iteration banned? Basically, this card is just a 2 mana draw 2 with upsides. Sure, you can only play one of the cards at turn, but that's more than easy enough to work around for the decks that care about it. Up until recently, Izzar Delver was generally considered the best deck in the format, and was one of 2 decks dominating the metagame. These decks were great at dominating the early game, but traditionally had an issue in the late game. Iteration both gave them a great late game, and helped them find their cards even more easily. Because Delver was simply too good for the metagame, and Iteration short of the deck's biggest weaknesses, Wizards banned the card to give other decks more counterplay against Delver. How could Expressive Iteration be fixed to be unbanned? The only fix I can think of is having it put one card into your hand and then just exile the next card from the top of your library, and you can play that card for the turn. Cards like Reckless Impulse are fine in the format, so it seems like the extra card selection is what makes Iteration so busted. Finally, we have White Plume Adventurer. This is a 3/3 Orc Cleric with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It has the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. It also has the ability where, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, you untap a creature you control. If you've completed a dungeon, you instead untap all of your creatures. The initiative is a mechanic where, whenever you take the initiative, or at the beginning of your upkeep, you venture into the Undercity. Whenever a player deals combat damage to an opponent with initiative, they take the initiative from them. The Undercity is a dungeon with rooms that you progress through each time you take the initiative from top to bottom, each giving you various effects. Why was White Plume Adventurer banned? To put it simply, they forgot to playtest initiative for 60 card formats. The entire mechanic ended up being way too good for the format, as it was initially designed for Commander. This led to Mono White Initiative, a deck that was built around using various forms of fast mana to try and play an initiative card as quickly as possible. This mechanic ended up being far too powerful for most fair decks to keep up with. So Wizards decided to ban White Plume as it was the only 3 mana card that let you take the initiative. Now could White Plume Adventure be fixed to be unbanned? The card just has to cost more. A card that just costs 3 mana and lets you take initiative would have been too good. There's no fix besides making it cost more or just removing the ability. Alright, and that's the series.